He wanted to erase her. She came back and sent him to prison instead. Carmen had done everything right. She built a business from scratch. She raised a brilliant daughter. She stayed loyal for 3 decades to a man who gave her little in return. And she never complained, never demanded, never stopped. And on a quiet Saturday morning, when she thought she was simply heading to visit her sick mother, her husband of 33 years handed her a coffee and destroyed everything she had ever trusted. She didn't fall asleep on the bus. She was drugged. Her body shut down mid-journey. Strangers screamed for help when they saw her. And somewhere back in the city, Richard was already doing what he had planned all along, beginning the process of erasing Carmen from her own life, her business, her home, her name. But here's what Richard forgot. You cannot erase a woman who has already survived everything life threw at her. You cannot delete someone who was built from struggle, from sacrifice, from love. And you absolutely cannot predict what happens when a woman like that wakes up. The most dangerous moment is not when we fall. It's when we rise and finally see clearly who was standing over us. Subscribe to this channel right now. This is the kind of story you don't want to start without knowing the end. Like this video, share it, and drop a comment. Where are you listening from? Let me know. This content was manually researched, built, and edited by our team to bring you meaning and real lessons from real human stories.
I often think about the stories that begin where others end, and Brandon's is one of them. It started in a place of constant motion and quiet desperation. New York's Port Authority bus terminal. For 33 years, he had been a husband to Stephanie. And on that day, he performed the role with chilling perfection, pressing a hot drink into her hands. I can almost hear the practiced gentleness in his voice as he told her, "Drink this, Steph. It's a long ride." Trust, built over 3 decades, is a powerful thing. She drank it without a second thought. As the world around her began to warp, the solid floor turning to liquid and the lights melting into surreal streaks, he guided her forward. And then came the words, a whisper against her ear that was meant to be the last thing she ever truly understood. In an hour, you won't even know your own name. In that horrifying final moment of clarity, she knew this wasn't a getaway. It was an erasure, but no plan, no matter how cruelly conceived, is ever truly perfect. Brandon's fatal error was arrogance. He couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't in complete control. He certainly never factored in the ghost of a man named Eric, a friend from a lifetime ago who would be standing at a desolate rest stop miles away. A man who would somehow see past the vacant, drugged expression on Stephanie's face and recognize the pure terror locked inside. He would later tell investigators, his voice still shaking with the sheer improbability of it all. "I just knew. My God, she was trembling. I had to ask her, what did he do to you?" That whole monstrous chain of events, a quiet betrayal that escalated into an impossible rescue, had started only hours before. It began on a Saturday morning that felt achingly normal, with the one tiny detail that signaled the world had tilted off its axis. Stephanie woke up to find Brandon already dressed and waiting for her. To understand the gravity of that, you have to picture a marriage that was 33 years old. Think about that for a moment. A life built from more than 12,000 shared mornings, a rhythm of quiet routines. For Brandon to be up and dressed, vibrating with a strange energy before she even woke up, was more than just odd. It was a seismic shift she was too close to feel. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice straining with a cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes. Ready for your big trip? The official story, the one they'd shared with family and friends, was simple. Stephanie was going to Montauk for a few days to look after her mother, who was recovering from a nasty bout of pneumonia. And from everything their friends told us, this trip was entirely Brandon's idea. He had been pushing it for weeks, insisting, "You need this, Steph. You've more than earned a break." And on the surface, he was right. She was the heart and soul of their life together. Stephanie had built a small fashion empire from the ground up, starting with a single table at a flea market in Queens and turning it into 3 thriving boutiques. She managed a team of over 20 people, dealt with suppliers from all over the world, and was the creative mind behind a brand that, quite literally, bore her name, because everything, from her business to their beautiful apartment on the Upper West Side, was in her name and hers alone. The boutiques, the deed to their home, the car she drove, every asset was a product of her own grit and vision. Brandon, in contrast, ran a small boutique wine importing business. It was his passion, a project that, as we later learned from their financial records, had managed the incredible feat of not making a single cent of profit in 33 years. But that's the story of so many partnerships, isn't it? One person carries the weight for two. You support the person you love. That was the narrative Stephanie had clung to. "Are you sure you don't just want to fly?" he'd asked her as she packed, already knowing she wouldn't, already counting on her deep-seated fear of flying as a critical component of his horrifying plan. "Brandon, you know I can't stand those things. They scare me to death," she'd said, giving him the same reply she always had. "The bus is totally fine." He didn't argue. It wasn't his style. As Stephanie carefully folded sweaters into her bag, Brandon paced the apartment, a nervous energy crackling off him in waves. He kept glancing at his watch, his movements clipped and anxious. "Bus leaves at 10, Steph. We should probably get moving." "Just relax, will you?" she'd said, trying to calm whatever was making him so agitated. "I have plenty of time." He offered a weak excuse about traffic, but it felt hollow, flimsy. From her perspective, he just seemed impossibly tense, a detail she tragically chalked up to him being worried about her sick mother. As she put on a final touch of lipstick, her phone started buzzing. It was their daughter, Jessica. And if there was one part of Stephanie's life that was an unqualified masterpiece, it was her daughter. At 30 years old, Jessica was a sharp, successful family law attorney, but she was also Stephanie's best friend. Their bond was the one constant in Stephanie's world, a daily phone call that kept them both grounded. "Hey, Mom, you okay?" Jessica's voice was an immediate source of comfort. "I'm fine, honey. Just finishing up my packing to go see Grandma." There was a pause then, a small void on the line that Stephanie knew all too well. It was the silence that always came before a difficult question. "Mom, are you really sure you're okay?" Jessica pushed. "I just have this awful feeling." Jessica always had an almost psychic intuition, a powerful gut instinct for when something was wrong, and that instinct was almost always pointed directly at her father. She hadn't trusted him since she was 16, when she came home from a shopping trip, devastated, swearing she had seen Brandon holding hands with some other woman. Stephanie, desperate to preserve the life she'd built, had completely dismissed her daughter's pain. She'd even told Jessica she was being melodramatic, that she was just trying to stir up trouble. Jessica never brought it up again, but that day, a permanent wall of ice formed between her and her father. The temperature in any room would drop by 10 degrees whenever he walked in. It was a silent, bitter Cold War, a deep-seated suspicion that Stephanie had to have been aware of but actively chose day after day to ignore. Acknowledging it would have meant accepting that her entire life was a lie. "I'm fine, honey. Please don't worry," she lied again. "Okay, Mom. Just call me the second you get there. Promise," Jessica pleaded. "I love you." After hanging up, Stephanie felt a heavy, unidentifiable sadness wash over her. She walked into the living room and found Brandon by the door, already holding her suitcase. He was smiling at her, but it wasn't his real smile. It was a cold, satisfied smirk she had never seen on his face before. The look of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. If she'd had even a hint of what he was truly planning, she would have grabbed that phone, called Jessica back, and screamed that she had been right about him all along. But she had no idea. And so, she followed him out the door. Down in the chaotic swirl of the terminal, she mentioned that her bus to Montauk usually departed from the lower level. "They changed companies, honey," Brandon said, his voice so smooth it was almost slick. "This one has newer buses. It's supposed to be better." She just nodded, too preoccupied to challenge the lie. Surrounded by the roar of engines and garbled announcements, she let him take the lead, trusting him completely to navigate the chaos, just like she always had. The one tiny thing that registered as odd, a small tear in the fabric of their 33-year routine, was that Brandon was carrying her bag. It seems like nothing, but in their entire marriage, he had never once carried a bag for her. It was one of those little courtesies he just never extended. But Stephanie was exhausted, drained by her work and by his frantic energy. She was just too bone-deep tired to recognize the blaring alarm that tiny, out-of-character act should have set off in her head. She did, however, notice the little beads of sweat forming on his brow, and the way his eyes darted around the station like he was looking for escape routes, or expecting to be caught. "Are you okay, Brandon?" she asked. "I'm fine, honey. It's just so hot in here." It wasn't hot at all. In fact, the terminal felt like a refrigerator. But once more, she allowed the lie to go unchallenged. "I'm going to grab you a coffee," he announced, already backing away. "Stay right here." He returned in less than 2 minutes, a timeline that was basically impossible for any coffee line at Port Authority. He was holding just one cup. "Here," he said, putting it in her hand. "This should keep you awake for the trip." She took a small sip. It tasted foul, acrid and intensely bitter, with a strange chemical note she couldn't place. She dismissed it immediately. "It's just bus station coffee," she reasoned. "It's always terrible." It was a simple, logical explanation that allowed her to ignore a terrifying truth. And it was nearly the last thought she ever had. She made herself take another sip, and then a third. The entire time, Brandon's eyes were locked on her with a strange, predatory intensity. He was waiting. You could feel the nervous anticipation coming off him in waves. "Come on, Steph. Your bus is boarding." He took her arm to help her up, and that's when she felt her own mind begin to drift away, like a balloon untethering from her body. "Brandon, I feel so strange," she managed to say, her words slurring together. "It's just the heat, honey," he answered, his voice a perfect imitation of concern. And then her legs gave out from under her. They just stopped working. As she fell against him, his arm wrapped around her waist, but the grip wasn't supportive. It was controlling, a vice-like hold. "Easy there, Steph. I've got you." He was essentially dragging her at this point, pulling her up the tall steps of the bus. Her vision had smeared into a meaningless blur of color and light. She couldn't have told you where that bus was going if her life depended on it, which, of course, it did. The driver shot them a curious look, but in the end, he just looked away. When a man like Eric walks into your office, you learn to see the story behind the story. He told me about that day, not with remorse, but with a chilling detachment, as if describing a project at work. He recalled holding a bus ticket for his wife Stephanie, a ticket he'd bought in cash to leave no trail. He described guiding her down the bus aisle, her confusion a sign of his success, her body already succumbing to the chemistry he'd so carefully administered. For him, her dizzy disorientation wasn't a source of panic. It was a confirmation of his control, a quiet hum of power as the world she knew began to dissolve around her. He leaned in, and he told me it was like whispering a final secret to a person who was already gone. The words he chose were a scalpel. "In an hour," he breathed into her ear. "You won't even remember your own name." He confessed this to me with a flicker of something. Not pride exactly, but a profound sense of closure. In his mind, he wasn't just abandoning a person. He was erasing a 33-year history he no longer wanted. He saw her silent, paralyzed fear not as a human tragedy, but as the final, necessary step in his liberation. He was the architect of her living death. When he pulled back and gave her that last cold smile, he was severing the final thread, a calculated expression of cruelty designed to be the last thing she remembered of him. A permanent scar on a mind he was about to wipe clean. "Goodbye, Stephanie." He told me saying her name felt formal, like closing a business deal. Then he turned and walked away without a single look back. That was crucial to him. He needed to prove to himself that he could do it cleanly. I watched him in my office as he recounted this, and I saw a man utterly disconnected from the weight of his actions. He described seeing his own reflection in the grimy bus window, just a regular man disappearing into a crowd. While inside that bus, the life he'd just shattered lurched forward into the anonymity of the highway. It was, for him, a perfect, untraceable exit from a life he had decided to cancel. Of course, he couldn't have known what was going through her mind as the drugs took hold. But we talked a lot about their daughter, Chloe. He admitted Chloe never liked him, that she always looked at him with a kind of knowing suspicion. "She saw something in me," he said once, "even before I saw it in myself." I believe that in those fading moments of lucidity, Stephanie's final thoughts were of her daughter's warnings, the puzzle pieces of her husband's hidden darkness finally clicking into place. For Eric, Chloe represented a persistent truth he could never quite control or extinguish, a witness to the monster he'd kept hidden for decades. He had imagined her fading quietly, a Jane Doe found hours later in a bus depot, the cause of death uncertain. The idea that she would be conscious of her own decline, trapped in a body that wouldn't respond, wasn't part of his clean, detached plan. He never pictured her adrift in that terrifying gray space when the driver announced a rest stop. The thought of other passengers moving around her, a world of normal life continuing just inches from her private horror, was a detail that seemed to genuinely disturb him when he learned of it later. It was a messy, human variable in his otherwise sterile equation. The panic he had so carefully orchestrated was meant to be a silent one. He certainly never envisioned a stranger turning around and screaming. The woman's cry, "My God, this woman is sick!" That was the first crack in his perfect crime. When I read the police report to him, describing how Stephanie's skin was cold and slick with sweat, how she was dragged from the bus by strangers. He just stared at the floor. He hadn't accounted for the compassion of others. In his world, people didn't intervene. His plan relied on a world as indifferent and cruel as he was. He had left her to die in obscurity on a cold bench at some forgotten stop along Interstate 95. It was supposed to be the perfect anonymous ending, a woman without a name or a past. The irony that her life was saved by a voice from that very past is almost literary. The arrival of a stranger, a good Samaritan, was an unforeseen complication. But the fact that this stranger's voice was clear, authoritative, and sliced through the noise with purpose, that was the twist of fate that would ultimately lead back to Eric's front door. A single, clear voice in the chaos was all it took to unravel everything. "I'm a doctor. Let me through." Eric and I spent weeks talking about this man, this ghost from another life. He pictured the scene as the police described it: a competent stranger kneeling, checking her pulse, lifting an eyelid. He imagined the doctor searching her purse for an ID, a professional trying to solve a medical mystery. Then came the moment of recognition, the shift from professional calm to stunned disbelief that he could never have anticipated. "Stephanie, is that you? Stephanie Moreau?" It was the one variable in the entire universe he could not have predicted. The past had just shown up to save her. When he learned the doctor's name was Michael Roberts, Eric went quiet for a long time. He remembered him. The quiet, smart kid from high school all those years ago. The thought of Stephanie, his Stephanie, managing to breathe that name, Michael, was a special kind of poison to him. It meant that even as her mind was being erased, a part of her could still access a memory that didn't include him. In his confession, he fixated on Michael's whispered words. "After all this time, what in God's name did he do to you?" It was the question Eric had spent his life trying to make sure no one would ever think to ask. We explored his high school memories. He remembered Michael as a non-entity, a scrawny, awkward kid who was an easy target. Eric, on the other hand, was one of the popular ones. He barely recalled the incident by the lockers where a few of his friends had shoved Michael around, but he did remember Stephanie stepping in. He described it not as an act of bravery on her part, but as her being overly dramatic. He saw her defense of Michael as a naive, bleeding heart gesture, never once considering it a sign of the fundamental decency that he himself so deeply lacked. The fact that Michael was in love with her back then was something Eric always knew. He'd treated it as a joke, a source of arrogant amusement. "The guy followed her around like a puppy," he told me, a dismissive wave of his hand. In his mind, there was never any real competition. He failed to understand the nature of their bond, a pure, supportive friendship. Eric didn't really believe in friendship without an angle. So, when he learned that this was the man who saved her, it recontextualized their entire history into a 40-year-long rivalry that, in the end, Eric had devastatingly lost. We pinpointed the exact moment their lives fractured. That afternoon in the school garden, 40 years before the rest stop. He told me he saw Michael about to talk to Stephanie, saw the nervous energy, and knew instinctively he was about to ask her to the prom. Eric's decision to honk the horn of his convertible, to call out with that easy confidence, "Stephanie, come on, I'll give you a lift," was a calculated power play. He saw a chance to assert his dominance and took it. He didn't just interrupt a conversation, he intercepted a destiny. For him, it was a minor victory, But it set the pattern for their entire relationship. What Eric wanted, Eric took. For 4 decades, he never gave Michael Roberts a second thought. 40 years. Then, on the dirty concrete of a highway rest stop, the boy he dismissed became the man who ruined everything. We talked through his reaction when he learned the details of the rescue. He was particularly incensed that Michael, a doctor, was able to piece it all together so quickly. He imagined Michael's mind working, the clinical expertise overriding any personal shock. He could almost hear the gears turning, connecting Stephanie's slurred speech to his own actions. His coffee. Eric. The coffee. When I told him what Stephanie had managed to say, he visibly flinched. Those few broken words were his undoing. And he knew that for a medical professional like Michael, that was more than enough. It was a direct line back to him. The 2 words Michael muttered, "That son of a bitch," became an obsession for Eric. It was the moment his carefully constructed anonymity shattered, replaced by an accusation from a man he hadn't seen in 40 years. The crisp, professional command to report a suspected acute poisoning was the sound of his perfect plan turning into a criminal investigation. The wail of approaching sirens wasn't a sound of hope. For Eric, it became the soundtrack to his failure. He had pictured a slow, quiet fade for Stephanie. Instead, she was surrounded by a flurry of urgent, life-saving activity, all orchestrated by the one person from her past who could truly appreciate the depth of his betrayal. He hated the image of Michael pleading with her, "I need you to stay with me." It was an intimacy and a protectiveness he himself had faked for years. Michael's promise, "You are not going to die, not while I'm here," was a direct challenge to the sentence Eric had passed on her. The final detail that seemed to break him was the paramedic's question. "Are you family, sir?" Eric had been her family for 33 years. He was the one who should have been there. Instead, it was Michael. He imagined the pause, the weight of 4 decades of unspoken history filling the space. And Michael's answer? "I'm a friend. I've been her friend for 40 years. 3 words that held more truth and loyalty than Eric's entire marriage. That friendship, the one he'd casually dismissed with a car horn all those years ago, was the thing that ultimately saved her life and condemned him. In all my years as a counselor, some stories burrow into you and never leave. Brandon's is one of them. When he first sat in my office, he painted a picture of a man undone by tragedy. But it was the ghost of another man, Eric, who haunted his narrative. He described the moment Eric, a doctor and a face from his wife's distant past, refused to leave her side. In Brandon's telling, it was an intrusion. In reality, it was a rescue. What he couldn't know then was that for his wife, Stephanie, seeing Eric's face was like finding a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. That night, Brandon's meticulously crafted world began to fracture because, against all his careful planning, she woke up. In a sterile hospital room, under the hum of fluorescent lights, Stephanie took her first breath back in a life he had tried to steal from her. Brandon had fantasized about that moment of her awakening. He described it to me with a chilling detachment. He envisioned a blank slate, an empty vessel, a mind wiped clean of the doctored coffee, the disorienting bus ride, and the coldness in his final words to her. He didn't want a widow's grief. He wanted a void, a perfect, beautiful emptiness where his wife used to be. But the dam of his fantasy broke. When news reached him that she was awake and lucid, the memories that rushed back weren't hers, they were his. A tidal wave of incriminating facts, the bitter chemical smell of the powder, the unnerving weakness in her legs as she stumbled away, the final false smile he'd given her. The perfect crime was suddenly just a portrait of his own failure. In an hour, you won't even remember your own name. He confessed those were his last words to her, a chilling promise of erasure that ultimately failed because she remembered everything. When he tried to see her, he was met by Eric, the old high school friend, now standing as a sentinel by her bed. I can only imagine the toxic cocktail of emotions brewing inside Brandon. The shock, the fury, the terror of being exposed. He told me he tried to play the part of the distraught husband, rushing forward with a performance of relief. But what he saw in Stephanie's eyes wasn't confusion, it was recognition. And in that moment, he knew his story was unraveling. She couldn't speak at first, her throat raw and dry, but Eric was there, a steady presence, offering a cup of water. Brandon wasn't. He was outside, locked out of the narrative he'd fought so hard to control. Stephanie's first question was about time. 9 in the morning, Eric told her. Sunday, you were out for nearly 20 hours. For Stephanie, it was a day stolen from her life. For Brandon, those 20 hours had been an agonizing tightrope walk between feigned sorrow for the world and the private, desperate hope that his wife was being chemically lobotomized on a bus to nowhere. The entire planet had spun on its axis, and his plan had spun out of control with it. What did he do? It was the question Brandon dreaded most. From his perspective, locked in a waiting room, he could only imagine the conversation. He pictured Eric, his calm a stark contrast to Brandon's own spiraling panic, taking her hands. He obsessed over how the truth would be delivered. Stephanie, listen to me, Eric would say. There is no gentle way to tell you this. And then, Stephanie, with a horrifying clarity Brandon never anticipated, would say it herself. I know, Brandon. He tried to kill me. But the truth Eric delivered was, as Brandon later admitted, a far more twisted plot. It was a truth that exposed a depravity beyond simple murder. The drug wasn't designed to stop a heart. It was engineered to dismantle a mind, piece by agonizing piece. What Brandon had chosen was a poison for the soul. He explained the science to me once, with a disturbing intellectual pride. A chemical designed to leave the body a functioning shell while completely scrubbing the person from the inside. Had Eric not found her, Stephanie would have woken up a ghost in her own skin, with no memory of her name, her life, or the daughter she adored. She would have been a breathing, empty vessel. He wanted to delete you, Eric told her, his voice a quiet storm of fury. Not end you, erase you. For Brandon, this was the perfect solution. No body, no murder investigation, just a missing person he could mourn publicly while celebrating privately. The betrayal was absolute, a sickness beyond any poison. Why? When Stephanie asked that question, it was a whisper of disbelief. Brandon, sitting in my office months later, still struggled to articulate a reason that didn't sound monstrous. I don't have that answer yet, Eric had told her, but I swear to you, we're going to get it. Then Eric produced the bus ticket he'd found in her purse. The destination wasn't the seaside getaway Brandon had so lovingly described. It was a one-way ticket to Omaha, Nebraska, a nearly 2-day journey into oblivion, and the name on the ticket was an invention, Maria Sanchez. The plan, as Brandon laid it out for me, was a masterpiece of cold psychological horror. He was going to lose you in the heartland, Eric explained to her. She would become an anonymous woman, a tragic Jane Doe found wandering with no memory, while he played the part of the grieving husband back home. And With her declared legally dead, he would inherit the empire she had painstakingly built. The boutiques, the apartment, the life, everything. Her entire existence erased so he could cash it in. 33 years of marriage, culminating in a plot to turn his wife into a ghost for profit. It was then, facing the sheer scale of his betrayal, that Stephanie's composure finally shattered. The sound of her grief, he imagined, must have filled that small hospital room. A raw, primal scream of a heart being broken beyond repair. While she was falling apart, Eric was her anchor, holding her hand, a silent, unwavering presence. When the storm of her sorrow passed, she looked at him, hollowed out. "What am I supposed to do now, Eric?" Brandon never counted on this. He never counted on Eric, and he never counted on the steel that began to form in his wife's eyes. Eric's response was the beginning of his end. "First, we bring in the law. You have that detective friend. You mentioned her once, Detective Miller. Detective Sarah Miller." They'd been friends since college, an unbreakable bond that Brandon had always dismissed as insignificant. He saw their friendship as a relic of the past, but it was about to become his future. "Call her," Eric urged Stephanie, his voice firm. "Tell her every last detail. And then we figure out our next move." Adrift in the wreckage of her life, Stephanie looked at the man who had saved her. And then she made the call. For Brandon, this was the moment the game truly changed. He was no longer the director of this tragedy. He was about to become its lead suspect. They had always been each other's emergency contact. Brandon knew about Detective Miller, but he never understood the depth of that loyalty. He couldn't comprehend a bond not based on transactional value. So while he was likely planning his next performance of grief, Stephanie was on the phone, arming her oldest friend with the truth. "Stephanie! Oh my God, what's happened?" Miller's voice was a jolt of reality. And so Stephanie told her everything, unspooling the entire nightmare, from the bitter coffee to the man who saved her life. She told her about the creeping chemical fog at the bus terminal and the final, chilling words Brandon had whispered to her. She explained how Eric, a friend from a lifetime ago, had appeared like a guardian angel and pulled her back from the brink of non-existence. On the other end of the line, Detective Miller was silent, her professional mind assembling the pieces of the crime. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold steel. "Stephanie," she said, her tone devoid of sympathy and full of lethal purpose. "I've met my share of spineless men, but your husband, he's in a class all his own." The hunt had begun. "Sarah, I need you." Stephanie's voice was a fragile plea. The reply was instant, a declaration of war on her behalf. "You've got me. I'm handling this personally." Detective Miller's instructions were precise, the strategy of a seasoned predator. "Your job is to stay put and stay quiet. No one finds out your memory is intact. I'm looping in Ashley on the legal end. She's the only one I'd trust with this." Stephanie agreed, a new resolve hardening around the edges of her fear. Brandon's carefully constructed narrative was about to be systematically dismantled by a team he never even knew existed. "And Stephanie?" A new voice, Ashley the lawyer, cut in. "Yeah?" "Look," Ashley said, her voice fierce with 30 years of friendship. "It's been us against the world since we were kids. Did you really think we'd let you go through this alone?" When the call ended, a single spark of hope ignited in the darkness. Brandon, meanwhile, was likely fuming about Eric, who had canceled a major keynote speech to stay. He couldn't comprehend it. In his mind, Eric's loyalty was an anomaly, an irrational act. Eric, you don't have to stay, Stephanie told him. I know I don't have to, Eric replied, his focus on the city outside. I want to. Then he reminded her of a day long ago. You saved me once, back in high school. A couple of bullies had me backed up behind the bleachers and you just showed up. Brandon would never understand this kind of loyalty. In our sessions, he viewed every relationship as a ledger of debts and payments. The memory of Stephanie standing up for a bullied kid was, to him, an irrelevant anecdote. To Eric, it was the foundation of a debt he was now repaying with interest. I'm not walking away from you now, Stephanie, Eric vowed. Not after this. In that quiet hospital room, a silent alliance was sealed. That night, as she stared at the ceiling, Stephanie made a promise to herself. She would find their daughter, Brittany, and tell her she was right about her father all along. It was a future Brandon had tried to erase, but one that was now rapidly approaching. He thought he was closing a chapter, but he had just started a war. While Brandon was likely trying to figure out how to salvage his story, Ashley, the lawyer, was tearing his real life apart with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, she had unearthed the truth he had spent years hiding. His prestigious wine import business wasn't just struggling, it had been completely bankrupt for 2 years. Every morning, he had kissed his wife goodbye and gone to play the part of a successful man, while his world was a smoldering ruin. But, as I learned from Brandon, that was only the first layer of his deception. When a man like Brandon sits in your office, you learn to see the cracks beneath the surface. He was a man drowning, not just in debt, but in the consequences of his own choices. He owed over $1 million, a figure he spoke with a chilling flatness to the kind of people who don't send polite reminders. This wasn't a business deal gone sour. It was a catastrophe born from smuggling, and his life was the collateral. But the immediate crisis, the one that drove him to seek counsel, had a name: Amber. She was his 32-year-old escape hatch, a personal trainer with impossibly white teeth and nails that tapped an impatient rhythm on every surface. She lived in a world of spray tans and skin-tight activewear, a world Brandon was desperately trying to buy for her. For his wife, Stephanie, the truth arrived in a manila envelope. Her best friend, Chloe, a private investigator, spread the photos across the sterile hospital blanket. It was a visual chronicle of her husband's second life. Brandon and Amber leaving a roadside motel, their hands intertwined at a shopping mall, sharing a meal at a restaurant Stephanie's hard-earned money had paid for. The affair was a 2-year marathon of deceit, built on the foundation of her unwavering trust. But the texts, Chloe said, her voice laced with a cold fury, they tell the real story. She began to read. There was Amber, prodding him, asking when he would finally get rid of the old hag. And then there was Brandon, a phantom presence in his wife's life, texting Amber promises that he would handle things soon. Every promise was for Amber, whose appetite for designer handbags and island getaways was being funded by the very company Stephanie was pouring her own savings into. The business she believed she was rescuing from the brink was nothing more than Brandon's personal piggy bank for his affair. Stephanie's voice was a barely audible rasp. Did she know about the debt? Chloe's nod was all the confirmation she needed. Amber knew everything. She was waiting in the wings, fully convinced that the moment Stephanie was erased, the assets, the business, the entire life she had built would simply default to her. Gone. It was such a clean, clinical word for the terrifying void he had planned for his wife. Chloe's investigation had led her to a pharmacist who folded the second he was shown a grainy photo from his own security camera. $15,000? That was the price to make a wife, a mother, a human being into a ghost, to chemically scour a lifetime of memories from her brain. We also have the footage from the bus station, Chloe added, her voice dropping to a grim, quiet register. It's all on tape, Stephanie. We see Brandon. We see him slip the powder into your coffee cup, carry your unconscious body onto that bus, and then just turn and walk away. He never once looks back. The entire act, from start to finish, preserved in digital clarity. On a purely logical level, Stephanie understood she should be a shattered mess. But something happens when you survive the unimaginable. After the first tidal wave of grief in the hospital, the tears simply stopped. In their place, a cold, diamond-hard fury began to form in her chest. "So, what's the next move?" she asked, her voice steady and sharp. A slow, determined smile spread across Chloe's face. "The next move? We let him spring his own trap. Brandon has already filed a petition with the court for emergency control of your assets. He's officially reporting you as a missing person," Chloe went on, a fierce light in her eyes. "And he's claiming he needs immediate access to your money to organize a search party for you." The sheer, monstrous audacity of it was almost brilliant in its wickedness. The court hearing is in 5 days, and you, my friend, are going to make a spectacular entrance. You will walk into that courtroom perfectly healthy, with every single memory he tried to steal, holding this mountain of proof. I'm telling you, the look on his face is going to be legendary. Stephanie murmured the words, letting the reality of it sink in. He designed the perfect crime. He just never planned on your best friend being a detective, Chloe finished with a wry smirk. They shared a laugh then, a sound devoid of actual happiness, but ringing with a powerful, shared resolve. Just having Chloe in her corner was an anchor in the dizzying storm. Chloe left that evening, promising to be back in a couple of days. But Eric, the man who had been a quiet pillar of support since this nightmare began, stayed. "You need to get some sleep," Stephanie told him, her eyes tracing the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. "You've been here for 3 days straight." Eric, the stranger who had found her disoriented and wandering on a deserted road, just looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. "I'll sleep when I know you're safe," he said simply. In the sterile hush of the hospital room, he was the quiet embodiment of everything Brandon had only ever pretended to be: gentle, steadfast, and fiercely protective. A comfortable silence filled the space between them, one born not of awkwardness, but of a deep, unspoken connection. That fragile sense of security was shattered the following morning by a phone call from Detective Evans. "Stephanie," the detective's voice was tight with urgency, "your husband just placed a call to this hospital." An icy dread seeped into Stephanie's bones. "Does he know I'm here?" Stephanie whispered, her throat closing around the words. "No," Evans replied. But it was a very close call. He's methodically phoning every single hospital along that bus route, asking about an unidentified woman in her 50s. "The receptionist was seconds from confirming your presence here when my team intervened. I've placed you under full police protection. Nothing and no one gets in or out with information about you. Understood?" Stephanie exhaled a breath she hadn't even known she was holding, but the relief was a thin veneer over a fresh layer of suffocating fear. "Detective, what if he finds out some other way?" Stephanie's voice trembled. "What if he tries to come here to finish what he started?" Detective Evans's tone was pure steel. "He won't get near you. I have 2 uniformed officers stationed outside your door around the clock. You are safe. I give you my word. Stephanie held on to that promise like a lifeline. There is one other thing, the detective added, an uncharacteristic note of hesitation in her voice. What is it? Stephanie asked, her stomach clenching. It's about your son. It's about Kevin. Kevin, her 32-year-old son. He had always been firmly in his father's camp, working at Brandon's company, always needing something. What about him? Stephanie pressed, a cold, sickening premonition twisting inside her. The detective let out a heavy sigh. Stephanie, he knew about the mistress. He's known for over a year. The hospital room, the entire world seemed to tilt and dissolve into a silent, nauseating blur. What? Detective Evans's voice was gentle but firm. We have the text messages between him and his father. Kevin knew all about Amber, and now he has formally agreed to testify on his father's behalf. He was preparing to stand in a court of law and paint a picture of his parents' beautiful, loving relationship. The air left Stephanie's lungs in a single, painful gasp. Her son, her own child, was actively choosing to side with the man who had tried to kill her. And Megan? She managed to ask, her daughter's name cracking in her throat. Megan is beside herself, Evans said. She's been down to the station 3 times in the last 2 days. She is convinced something is terribly, horribly wrong. Of course she was. Megan always saw things with perfect clarity. After she hung up the phone, Stephanie could do nothing but stare at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. Eric sat in the chair next to her bed, a silent, solid presence in the storm of her thoughts. But there were no words that could soothe this particular kind of wound. Brandon had almost located her, a horrifying reminder of how close she'd come to being permanently erased. But that wasn't the injury that was bleeding the most. The deepest cut, the one that felt truly fatal, was the betrayal of her own son, who had stood by and watched it all unfold, and then chosen a side. Sleep was impossible that night, her mind a torture chamber replaying the detective's words in the dark. Her son knew. For more than 12 months, as Kevin watched his father systematically tear their family apart, he had said nothing. The question of why burned in Stephanie's mind like a hot iron. She sifted through a lifetime of memories, desperately searching for the fracture, for the moment the bond with her son had been broken. Kevin had always been his father's echo, a smaller version of Brandon, even as a young boy. He had idolized him, a memory that now felt twisted and sinister, a warning sign she had tragically misinterpreted. He would plead to go with Brandon on so-called business trips, his eyes shining with pure adoration when his father came home bearing a new video game or some other expensive toy just for him. He would parrot Brandon's opinions on every subject, treating his father's words like gospel. Stephanie had always seen it as a normal case of hero worship, a boy looking up to his dad. What could possibly be wrong with that? The answer, she now realized, was everything. Because those trips weren't about business. They were romantic getaways with his mistress. Brandon hadn't just lied to his son. He had made him a co-conspirator. He had bought Kevin's silence with a steady stream of cash and gifts, effectively grooming him to become an accomplice in the planned destruction of his own mother. And Kevin had accepted the terms. He took the path of least resistance because the money was good, and because his father had never once modeled what it meant to have a moral compass. A sharp, sickening wave of guilt washed over Stephanie. She shared the blame. She had been so consumed with building her own successful business, the one that paid all their bills, while Brandon played the role of a high-flying CEO. In her relentless drive to provide a good life for them, she had inadvertently handed over her son's moral education to a sociopath. But Megan was different. She had always been cut from another cloth entirely. From the time she was a toddler, she was her mother's shadow. When Stephanie opened her very first clothing stall in a local flea market, an 8-year-old Megan would sit on a stool by the cash box, diligently doing her homework, her wide, observant eyes absorbing every single nuance of her mother's world. When I work with families, I often think of Brandon and the picture-perfect life he tried so methodically to destroy. His wife, Stephanie, was the kind of woman who could build an empire from a single thread of an idea, all on her own grit. And their daughter, Megan? She seemed to be born with an innate wisdom. Stephanie once told me a story. A customer left her little shop in tears one day, and a very young Megan asked what was wrong. Stephanie gave the usual parent response. "Oh, her husband did something unkind, honey." But Megan pressed. "What did he do?" Stephanie tried again. "It's grown-up stuff, sweetie." Megan looked her right in the eye and said something that still gives me chills. "I don't want to wait until I'm a grown-up to understand. I want to help her right now." By the time she was 12, that same girl was practically running the store's entire inventory system. In my line of work, you learn that family histories are rarely as they seem. When I first met Brandon, he spoke of his daughter, Jessica, with a strange mix of pride and distance. He described her as a child who was almost unnervingly sharp, a prodigy of logistics, and as he put it. He'd tell me how she would patrol the aisles of his wife's boutiques, her young mind a perfect running tally of the inventory. He recalled her telling her mother, Stephanie, with dead certainty, "We're missing 3 of the blue blouses in a medium, and that last shipment was 2 skirts short." When Stephanie, amazed, would ask how she knew, Jessica's simple reply, "I counted," felt to Brandon less like a talent and more like an indictment, a kind of constant, silent judgment of their world. By 15, he said, she managed the sales floor with an authority that made him, her own father, feel like a visitor in his family's empire. The boutiques Stephanie built were more than just stores. They were sanctuaries. Brandon described them with a hint of resentment as places where women would come to unload the burdens of their lives. He knew his wife had a gift for listening, for making these women feel understood. But from his perspective, sitting on the outside, he saw his daughter, Jessica, absorbing a very specific narrative. In that shop, she was mainlining the unedited stories of marriage, the betrayals, the quiet resentments, the gut-wrenching pain of women who felt discarded after dedicating their lives to their families. So, it felt almost like a personal attack to him when Jessica announced one day, with a resolve that chilled him, "Mom, I know what I want to do. I'm going to be a family law attorney." It was a declaration of war he didn't yet understand. "Why that, sweetie?" Stephanie had asked, genuinely curious. I can still hear the echo of Brandon's voice in my office as he recounted Jessica's reply, baffled by the venom he perceived in it. "Because someone has to help them," she'd said. "I have to fight for them and get them what they deserve." Stephanie, he recalled, had been overwhelmed with pride, pulling her into a fierce hug. Brandon saw it differently. He saw a daughter choosing a side, and it wasn't his. He never imagined his wife would one day need that same protection. The first real crack in the foundation of his world appeared when Jessica was 16. She came to her mother, claiming she'd seen him, Brandon, her unimpeachable father, with another woman? But Stephanie's denial was a fortress built over a decade of willful ignorance. She didn't just dismiss it, she savaged her own daughter, calling her a liar, accusing her of fabricating stories out of teenage spite. For Brandon, this was a crucial victory. His wife had chosen him. Jessica never raised the subject again. But a wound that deep doesn't vanish, it festers. When Brandon looked at his daughter, he saw a new caution in her eyes. An invisible wall went up between them. Their conversations became brief, functional, stripped of all warmth. And Stephanie, desperate to maintain the illusion of their perfect life, simply ignored the growing chasm. It was easier for everyone to pretend. At 18, Jessica left for college to study pre-law, and Brandon felt a sense of relief. Then, at 23, she hit a wall, failing her first attempt at the bar exam. The call to her mother was filled with shame and ragged sobs, a moment of vulnerability that Brandon admitted, in a quiet moment of therapy, gave him a dark flicker of satisfaction. He saw it as the world knocking her down a peg. But Stephanie, a woman who had built an enterprise from a folding table at a flea market, was forged from pure steel. She told her daughter, "Jessica, you get up, you dry your eyes, and you do it again. It's who we are." And Jessica did exactly that. She passed the exam with a vengeance. By the time she was 30, she wasn't just another lawyer. She had become a titan in family court, a name whispered with both fear and awe. She specialized in the most volatile cases, the vicious domestic abuse battles, the divorces so poisonous they scorched everyone involved. She had become the avenger for women just like the ones from her mother's shops, women shattered by men just like her father. And she was brilliant at it, a fact that Brandon found both impressive and utterly terrifying. The bond between Stephanie and Jessica was something Brandon could never penetrate. It was a closed circuit. They talked on the phone every day, and their weekly lunch was an unbreakable appointment. Jessica was Stephanie's anchor, the one person who could read her mother's moods like the weather. He felt that she could sense a storm in Stephanie's voice before he even knew it was cloudy. And she celebrated her mother's wins with a purity he found unnerving. He once overheard Jessica telling her mother during a Sunday brunch, her voice thick with admiration, "Mom, you are my absolute hero. You took a single table at a flea market and turned it into this whole world with 3 boutiques. My biggest hope is to be half the woman you are." Stephanie had just laughed it off. "You already are, honey, and you're so much more." Jessica had simply smiled and said, "Never." Brandon saw this not as love, but as an alliance that defined him as the outsider. Now, as the full story unraveled, the consequences of the rift he'd created were stark. His son, Eric, had sided with him, lured by the promise of money and power. He had chosen his father. But Jessica had always chosen her mother. With Stephanie now missing and presumed to be in danger, Eric was preparing to be the legal face for the man who had orchestrated it all. At the same time, Jessica was moving heaven and earth to find her. Stephanie, recovering in secret, knew she had to make contact. She had to dismantle the entire universe of lies Brandon had so carefully constructed. Detective Evans gave her the green light, affirming what was already clear. Jessica was not just her daughter. She was about to become the most critical weapon in the fight for her life. Late that afternoon, the call was made. Jessica's name lit up the screen. "Honey," Stephanie whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of it all. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" The sound that came through the phone wasn't just a cry. It was the raw, guttural sound of a soul breaking open with grief and overwhelming relief. Jessica was sobbing, a torrent of emotion so powerful it seemed impossible it could come from such a composed woman. Detective Evans just called me. Thank God, I was so terrified. Mom, I really thought you were gone. I'm here, my baby, Stephanie managed to say, as her own tears finally began to fall. I'm alive. I knew it. Jessica wept, her voice shredded. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. Mom, when you stopped answering my calls, when I didn't get that good night text, I felt this awful, crushing weight right in the middle of my chest. Stephanie's sobs were racking her body now. I should have believed you, honey. All those years ago, 14 years ago, you tried to tell me what you saw. An immense, heavy silence hung between them, punctuated only by the sound of Jessica trying to catch her breath. You remember that? She finally asked, her voice a ghost of a whisper. I never forgot it for a single second, Jessica. I couldn't accept it was true. And for that, I am more sorry than I can ever say. I'm sorry I refused to listen, Stephanie cried, for calling you a liar. Oh, God, Jessica, for choosing him over you, my own child. Jessica's voice was a fractured mix of pain and absolution. No, Mom, forgive me. Forgive me for giving up, for not screaming at you until you finally saw him for the monster he is. Forgive you? You have to forgive me, honey. You saw everything clearly from the very beginning. And I was such a blind, trusting fool. You were not a fool, Jessica shot back, a sliver of the courtroom warrior piercing through her grief. You were a wife who loved and trusted her husband. That is never a crime. It was wrong, honey. It was all wrong. And that trust almost cost me my life. Jessica's first instinct was pure protective rage. She wanted to jump in her car right then, to drive to New Haven and physically shield her mother from the world. Not yet, honey, Stephanie said, her voice finding a new core of strength. Detective Evans has a plan. There's a court date in 5 days. I am going to walk into that room alive and well with an entire mountain of evidence against your father. What court date? Jessica asked, the confusion evident in her voice. And so Stephanie explained Brandon's unbelievably audacious scheme. Brandon was filing a petition for emergency guardianship over her entire estate. His story was a work of fiction. His beloved wife had tragically vanished, and he needed immediate access to her assets to fund a massive, desperate search effort. I will be there, Jessica said. And in that one sentence, the sobbing daughter was gone, replaced entirely by the attorney. No, honey, you don't have to do that. I am going to represent you at that hearing, Mom, she cut in, her tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. After all, you're the one who taught me what real strength is. You taught me how to fall and get right back up, she went on, her voice vibrating with a powerful sense of justice. You were the one who told me to wipe away the tears and try again. Well, now I get to do that for you. So please don't even try to argue with me on this. Stephanie started crying again, but these weren't the tears of a victim. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude and a pride so intense it was a physical ache in her chest. A love for her daughter that was vast and all-consuming. What did I ever do to deserve a daughter like you? She whispered. And Jessica's reply was simple, clear, and absolutely devastating in its truth. You raised me, she said. That's what you did. 2 days before the hearing, Detective Evans showed up at the hospital and she came bearing gifts. She was carrying the very weapons they would use to dismantle Brandon's world. A heavy manila folder packed with irrefutable evidence, crystal clear security footage, printed transcripts of his incriminating text messages, and even a fully signed and notarized confession from the pharmacist he had manipulated. The strategy is simple, the detective said, laying out the documents on the bedside table like a roadmap of Brandon's downfall. Brandon's filed for emergency access to your assets. Ms. Davies, the lawyer, laid it out, her voice a calm, professional anchor in the storm. He's claiming in court that you vanished, and he needs the funds to orchestrate a search. Stephanie made a sound then, a dark, empty echo that wasn't anything close to a laugh. It was the sound of irony poisoning a wound. So, he orchestrates my disappearance, she murmured, and now he wants to use my own money to play the hero looking for me. It was a classic, chilling move from a manipulator's playbook, painting himself as the concerned husband while trying to seize control. That's the move, Ms. Davies confirmed. The hearing's this Thursday, 2 p.m., at the Manhattan courthouse. You're going to be there. You'll walk in, very much alive, perfectly lucid, with every memory he tried to erase fully intact. And I'll have all of this, Stephanie added, gesturing to the stacks of evidence that told the real story. Her voice held a fragile strength. The look on his face when he sees me, I can't even begin to picture it. A grim, determined smile touched the lawyer's lips. It will be more satisfying than you can imagine. This is the kind of thing they write case studies about. Across the room, her old friend Eric sat, a quiet pillar of support. He hadn't left her side since this whole nightmare began. In my line of work, you see so much damage done by men like Brandon, but Eric's steadfast presence was this silent, powerful reminder that good men, decent men, still exist in the world. He was the living antithesis of the man she had married. Miss Davies let the silence stretch for a moment, her gaze shifting from Eric and settling on Stephanie with a kind of practiced, professional empathy that I've seen so many times. It's a look that says, I'm sorry, but we have to go deeper. There's something else we need to address, she said, her voice soft but firm. It concerns your son, Kyle. A visceral, icy dread immediately twisted in Stephanie's stomach. I saw her physically recoil. What about him? The lawyer slid another folder across the table. It was filled with more printouts, screenshots of text messages between Brandon and their son. These weren't from last week. They went back months and then years. The story Kyle had told them, that he'd only just found out about the affair, was a complete fabrication. But that wasn't the most sickening part. Not by a long shot. What we later pieced together was that in the frantic hours after Stephanie was first rushed to the hospital, the very first person Brandon called was Kyle. He wasn't calling out of concern. He was calling to establish the narrative. He was coaching his own son, scripting the story of a picture-perfect marriage and a wife who had never shown a single sign of being unhappy. This is a profound form of psychological grooming, shaping a child's reality to serve the abuser's needs. And Kyle's response, preserved in a cold, damning screenshot, was the linchpin. I'm with you, Dad. I'll say the marriage was perfect. Those words weren't just a son supporting his father. They were the laying of the first brick in a wall of conspiracy built in real time. The investigation broke wide open when a warrant was approved to tap Brandon's phone. That's how they captured the recording that would shatter everything. It was Kyle's voice, shockingly clear and unnervingly calm. The casual cruelty of it is what turns your stomach. Dad, Did Mom suspect anything? He asks. His tone is so light, you'd think he was asking if it was going to rain. Brandon's voice comes back, a smooth, reassuring wave of pure malice. Don't worry, she didn't suspect a thing. But it's Kyle's next question that truly chills you to the bone. He asks a logistical follow-up, a cold inquiry about whether his mother had found the poison, reducing her life to nothing more than a problem to be managed. I was told that the first time Stephanie heard that recording, she stumbled into the bathroom and was violently sick. It wasn't just her body expelling the last of the physical poison, it was her spirit trying to purge the ultimate betrayal. To realize your husband wants you dead is a unique and profound horror. But to then hear your own son, the child you raised, calmly discussing the logistics of your murder, that's a level of darkness that defies comprehension. When she came out of the bathroom, shaken and pale, Eric was right there to hold her steady. Her voice was a fractured whisper. "I can't do it," she breathed. "I can't go to court and face both of them, not him and not my son. I can't do this," Stephanie whispered again, the words breaking under the impossible weight of it all. Her friend later told me it was like watching her will to fight just dissolve into ash. I just want to disappear, start over somewhere new, so far away they could never, ever find me. Eric and Ms. Davies shared a look of utter helplessness. Because what can you say to that level of pain? Then, a sharp buzz sliced through the heavy silence in the hospital room. A phone vibrated on the nightstand. Stephanie answered, her voice thick with tears she couldn't shed. Emily. Her daughter's concern was immediate, a tangible force coming through the phone. "Mom, what is it? You don't sound right." "I can hear it in your voice, Mom." Emily pushed, her intuition cutting through the static of her mother's grief. And just like that, the dam broke. Stephanie told her everything about Brandon, the poison that had coursed through her veins, the ice-cold texts, and, finally, the audio recording that had sealed the fates of a father and his son. A deep, crushing silence hung on the line. When Emily finally spoke, her voice had been remade. The worried daughter was gone, and in her place was a warrior forged in that single, terrible moment. "Mom, you need to listen to me right now," Emily said, her tone suddenly like steel. Stephanie, completely defeated, tried to push back. "Honey, I can't." Emily's reply was like a defibrillator to the soul. "You can." There was something in that voice, a conviction so absolute that it made Stephanie stop. "For 14 years of my life," Emily said, each word heavy with the truth of those years, "I have known Dad was a bad person. 14 years, I was told I was making things up, that I was just being dramatic. I watched you make excuses for him, so I learned to be quiet." What could Stephanie say? It was the devastating, unvarnished truth. "And do you know why I never wrote you off?" Emily continued. "Because you didn't write me off when I failed my bar exam the first time. Do you remember what you told me?" Emily challenged. "Get up, dust yourself off, and go again." So I did, and I passed it because of you. Another pause, but this one felt charged with a new kind of energy. "So now it's my turn to say it to you. Get up, Mom. Dust yourself off, walk into that courthouse, and you burn them both to the ground." Fresh tears began to stream down Stephanie's face. But these were different. They weren't tears of grief. They felt like gasoline and fire. "You built a whole business from one box of secondhand clothes at a flea market." Emily's voice boomed, a powerful incantation of a strength her mother had forgotten she owned. You raised two kids almost by yourself while dad was always working late. You survived being poisoned by the one person who swore to protect you. And you're telling me you can't look a coward and his pathetic, entitled son in the eye? And then a sound bubbled up through the tears that stunned everyone in the room. A laugh. It was a watery, cracked sound, but it was real. It was the sound of a comeback. One more thing, Mom, Emily added, her voice sharp as a blade. If you don't go, I will. I will go into that courtroom by myself, and I will take them apart, piece by excruciating piece. But I would much rather have you sitting right there next to me. You deserve to see the look in their eyes when they finally understand that the game is over. I was told Stephanie looked over at Eric and Ms. Davies, who were listening, completely captivated. You're just like me, she said into the phone, a new strength hardening her voice. I know, Emily answered. And that's why you're getting out of that bed and you're coming with me. Stephanie took a long, centering breath, wiping the tear tracks from her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice was solid iron. Okay, honey, I'll go. A smile was almost audible on the other end of the line. That's my mom. That phone call was the lifeline that pulled her back to shore. It gave her 5 days. 5 days to prepare to confront the man who tried to murder her and the son who helped him. But she wasn't walking in there alone. She had Eric, Ms. Davies, and her own personal champion, her daughter Emily, right beside her. Those 5 days before the hearing were a unique form of torment. Physically, Stephanie was recovering as the poison slowly worked its way out of her system. But the emotional trauma was like shrapnel in her soul. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat, the memory of Brandon's lies still twisting in her dreams. During the day, the memories were like ambushes. The faintly bitter taste she remembered in her coffee, the sudden, terrifying weakness that had made her legs give out, the profound betrayal of her own body turning against her. Through every one of those agonizing seconds, Eric was her anchor. He simply refused to leave her side, spending his nights in a stiff, unforgiving visitor's chair next to her hospital bed. He was always up before she was, bringing her coffee from the cafeteria, and, in a quiet ritual of deep care, he always took the first sip right in front of her. You don't have to do that, she told him on the third day. His reply was simple and profound. I know, but I need you to feel safe. They spent hours just talking, filling in the quiet gaps of the last couple of decades. She learned things about Eric she'd never known. He had been married for 22 years to a woman named Kate, an oncologist who, in one of life's most brutal twists of irony, had died from cancer 3 years before. Life's got a pretty sick sense of humor, he said, a familiar pain flickering in his eyes. She spent her entire career saving people from that disease, and it's the very thing that took her from me. Stephanie could see that his love for Kate was still so present. She was my partner, my best friend. She was everything. When she died, I honestly had no idea how I would keep going, he admitted, his voice hushed with the memory of that pain. But you did, Stephanie said softly. We always go on, Stephanie. That's what we do. Hearing him articulate that shared human truth, she felt a guarded wall inside her finally begin to crumble. She started to talk about her own marriage to Brandon, about the years of gnawing loneliness and the small, persistent doubts she had so carefully buried. Then Eric asked a question that sliced right through it all. You were never really happy with him, were you? In one of our sessions, Brandon described a pivotal moment in the hospital that I believe was the real start of Stephanie's healing. He asked her, with the kind of directness only a deep crisis allows, if she had truly been happy with Eric. I can still hear the quiet awe in his voice as he recounted her reply. She admitted she thought she was, or perhaps had, just grown accustomed to the shape of her life. It's a common state I see, a kind of emotional inertia. But Brandon gently guided her to a profound realization. He reminded her of Olivia, her daughter, and told her, "That's the real thing, Stephanie. That's your happiness." He wasn't just comforting her, he was re-anchoring her identity to something pure and unbreakable. And he saw the truth of it land in her eyes. It was a powerful thing to witness, he said, seeing someone find their anchor in the middle of a storm they didn't even know they were in. On the fourth night, exhaustion was winning, but sleep wouldn't come for her. Brandon told me he pulled his chair right up to her bedside, the quiet of the room making everything feel heavier. He felt a deep need to bridge the 40-year gap between them, to show her who he had been before life reshaped them both. "Stephanie," he asked, his voice low, "can I tell you something?" When she agreed, he took a breath and asked, "Do you remember prom night in the school garden?" He watched her close her eyes, and he waited, hoping the memory was still there for her, too. He painted the scene for me so vividly, it felt like I was there. June 1983. That high school gym felt like the center of the universe, a throbbing electric space humming with endings and beginnings. He remembered the tacky blue and white balloons, the suffocating scent of hairspray, and some song blasting from the speakers that already felt like a memory in the making. He'd been watching her from across the room, seeing her by the punch bowl, and knew that if he didn't act then, he never would. For him, seeing her was like a lighthouse beam cutting through the noise. He described the monumental effort it took to even look the part that night. He'd abandoned his usual worn-out t-shirt for a crisp button-down his mom had ironed twice. He'd wrestled his hair into submission and, in a fit of bravery, left his thick glasses at home, feeling utterly exposed. "Stephanie, could I steal you for a minute?" He told me, his voice almost cracked. He watched her friends dancing, a chaotic mess of joy, and felt a surge of relief that no one would notice her slipping away with him. He led her out into the school's quiet garden, a place he'd chosen deliberately, where the honeysuckle hung thick in the air and the moon felt like it was shining just for them. He stopped under an old oak tree, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a tremor running through his whole body. "Stephanie, He remembered how the words he'd practiced for weeks just evaporated. "What is it? Are you okay?" He recalled her asking, her genuine concern cutting right through his wall of anxiety. He stumbled over his words, telling me, "I told her I'd run through it 1,000 times, but just seeing her there, the script was gone." And then she'd laughed, a real warm sound that broke the tension. "Breathe, Brandon. It's only me. You can say anything." That kindness gave him the courage to finally look her in the eye. He told me that, in that moment, he let her see everything he had kept hidden for so long. "Stephanie, we've been friends for 3 years," he began, the words feeling fragile but true. "And in all that time, you've been the most important person in my life." He finally said it out loud, how she was the one who defended him from bullies, the only person who could make him laugh when he felt completely broken. "You made me feel like I wasn't invisible," he continued, laying his heart bare under that silver moonlight. The memory was so clear, he could still feel the phantom sensation of his own heart pounding. I don't know any other way to say this, but he took a small step closer, every nerve ending firing with a mixture of terror and hope. Stephanie, I. And then the sound. A car horn blasted through the night, shattering the delicate moment into a million pieces. A flashy red sports car had pulled up, and leaning against it, with an easy confidence Brandon had always envied, was Eric. Stephanie, let's go. I'll drive you home. It was Eric, the school's star quarterback, the guy who lived effortlessly in the spotlight. Brandon watched as Stephanie's attention snapped toward him, drawn by the pull of that bright, easy world. He saw her glance back at him, her kind, awkward friend, trembling on the verge of a confession that would have changed everything. "Sorry, Brandon," she'd said, already turning toward the car. "We can talk later." The words were casual, but for him, they were a death sentence. With that one turn, she was gone. He stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of what he hadn't said. He never knew if she saw the devastation on his face or understood that later was a promise that would hang in the air, unanswered, for 40 years. Back in the hospital room, as he finished the story, he blinked, returning to the present. "I was going to ask you to be my girlfriend," he told her, his voice thick with the ghost of that night. "I was going to tell you I'd been in love with you since I was 14, that you were the most fiercely brilliant person I'd ever met. That all I wanted was to spend my life trying to make you happy." He finished, the words filling the sterile silence of the room. And then Eric pulled up with that stupid car and that perfect smile, and you were gone. I could hear the echo of that old pain when Brandon told me about Stephanie's response. How she just breathed, I didn't know. He assured her, "I know, you were a kid." And well, he was Eric. In that moment, he wasn't just telling a story. He was absolving her of a guilt she never knew she carried. "I stood in that garden for an hour after you left," he confessed, "just trying to figure out what was so fundamentally wrong with me. That rejection became the engine of my entire life," he explained to me during one session. This is a classic trauma response, channeling pain into relentless ambition. I decided I would become someone impossible to ignore. A doctor, someone with status. I was going to build a life so impressive that it would prove I was good enough. When Stephanie insisted he never had to prove anything, he told her, "I see that now, but all my younger self understood was that you chose him because he was better. And I have spent 40 years running a race that had been over before I even started." She asked him then if he regretted it, not fighting harder for her that night. His answer, he said, came without a single thought. Every single day, for my entire life. It was the first time he'd ever admitted that out loud to anyone but himself. He told me a broken smile came to his face, but that for the first time in decades, he felt a flicker of hope. "But this," he told her, looking at her in that hospital bed, "this feels like a second chance, and I am not about to waste it." It was as if that declaration changed the air in the room, because the very next day, a new force arrived. He heard it first, the sharp, purposeful sound of heels clicking down the hallway. When the door opened, Brandon saw a young woman who was the spitting image of her mother, but remade for battle. It was Olivia, her daughter, dressed in a severe black pantsuit, a leather briefcase in her hand like a weapon. He said she projected an aura of intimidating power. But all of that professional armor, he told me, completely disintegrated the second her eyes met her mother's. Mom. The word came out as a broken whisper. Brandon watched as this formidable woman surged forward, collapsing onto the bed and holding her mother not just with love, but with a kind of desperate, primal need. It was the hug of someone who had been staring into a terrifying abyss. Oh my God, Mom. Olivia sobbed into Stephanie's shoulder. I was so scared. Thank God you're here. Brandon quietly witnessed Stephanie, weak as she was, holding her daughter, pouring her own strength back into her child. I'm right here, baby. I'm not going anywhere. It was a sacred, silent moment between them. That reunion marked the end of one nightmare, but Brandon saw it immediately pivot into the beginning of a war. As soon as the tears subsided, Olivia's entire presence shifted. She straightened up, her expression hardening into one of pure steel. The lawyer was back. Tell me everything, she said, her voice devoid of warmth, replaced by a cold, clinical precision. She grilled her mother for every single detail of the ordeal, every piece of information from Detective Hayes. As Stephanie spoke, Brandon watched Olivia's pen fly across a legal pad. It was, he said, like watching a grandmaster planning out every move on a chessboard. Brandon told me he saw that same fire in Olivia's eyes that he had always admired in Stephanie, and he felt a wave of pride for this young woman he barely knew. When the whole horrific story was out, Olivia finally looked up from her notes. The strategy is simple, she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. We let him go first. We let Eric have his moment. The grieving husband, frantic with worry, putting on a show for the court. A tiny, sharp smile touched Olivia's lips. A look Brandon knew spelled absolute ruin for her opponent. He recognized it as the look of a predator. I'll enter the courtroom first, as your counsel, Olivia detailed. You wait outside. When the judge asks for representation, I'll introduce myself. And then you will walk in. The plan was breathtaking in its righteous theatricality. And Eric? Eric is going to have a complete and total meltdown. Not a real one, of course, Olivia added with a sliver of dark humor. But the look on his face will be worth every second of this hell. And then we have Kevin. At the mention of her brother's name, Olivia's expression turned to ice. Brandon watched the shift, a chilling display of familial schism. Kevin made his choice, she said, her voice flat and final. He backed the wrong horse, and it's time he learned about consequences. Brandon then saw the profound pain that shot through Stephanie. Even after such a deep betrayal, he was still her son. Olivia, she whispered, her voice shaking. I don't know if I can't look at him. Facing Eric is one thing, but Kevin? Olivia's hand shot out, her grip firm on her mother's arm. Brandon saw it as both a grounding and a warning. Mom, listen to me. Kevin knew. He knew for over a year that Dad was having an affair, and he did more than stay silent. He actively agreed to be his witness, to lie for him, to throw you away. Stephanie began a weak protest, but Olivia cut her off with surgical precision. No, there is no but here, Mom, she stated, her voice like iron. He chose the money. He chose the allowance, the downtown condo Dad pays for, the entire spoiled life that man bought for him. He used you as a shield so he wouldn't have to get a real job, his daughter Chloe said, her voice laced with a bitterness that cut right through the bone. His wife Stephanie just stood there, completely hollowed out by the sheer, unvarnished cruelty of it all. And while he was living off my grandfather's money, Chloe went on, her words building into an indictment. While he was actively choosing to be his father's son every single day, I was at the precinct 3 times in 48 hours, pleading with Detective Miller to let me join the search teams. I was spending my nights chasing ghosts, following every dead end lead, and breaking down in a bathroom stall at my office because I genuinely believed my mother was gone forever. I'm told that tears were streaming down Chloe's face, but her voice was as steady and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. I was always on your team, Mom. Always. Even when I was 16 and tried to tell you what Dad was really like, and you refused to see it, even then, I never gave up on you. Not for a second. Because that's what family is supposed to do. In that instant, Stephanie just collapsed into her daughter, holding on to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. My baby girl, she whispered into her hair, my little warrior. I know, sweetie. I know, Stephanie breathed, her voice choked with the grief of a lost decade. And I am so, so sorry. Sorry that I didn't listen, that I chose him over and over again. You deserved so much better from me. I had the best mom, Chloe countered, pulling back to meet her eyes. He just had you hypnotized, but you're awake now, and we're going to make him pay for every single thing. Later, however, Stephanie had to face an entirely different kind of fear, introducing Chloe to Nathan. She confessed afterward that she hadn't felt that kind of skin-crawling anxiety in years. Chloe was her rock, her champion, the one person whose approval meant everything. And Nathan? Nathan was the man who had found her when she was lost, who had literally pulled her back from the brink, and who was slowly, patiently showing her that her life wasn't over. For what felt like an eternity, Chloe just sized him up, that intense, analytical gaze of hers taking him apart, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of a lie, any red flag at all. And then, miraculously, a real, unguarded smile broke across her face. So, she said, skipping any pretense of small talk, you're the guy who saved my mom. Nathan just gave a small, modest shake of his head, a warmth rising in his cheeks. I was just in the right place at the right time. No, it was more than that, Chloe insisted, her tone absolute. Detective Miller told me everything. You skipped a major work event. You stayed by her side at the hospital for days. You watched over her like she was. She paused, trying to find the right words. Like she was someone who was precious. She is someone who is precious, Nathan said. The statement so simple and final, his eyes locked on Stephanie. She always has been. And Chloe slowly turned to her mother. Stephanie saw it in her daughter's face immediately. A profound sense of acceptance, of relief, of complete and total approval. Mom, I like him, Chloe announced with her trademark bluntness. He looks at you the way you're supposed to be looked at. Stephanie was taken aback. The right way? Chloe nodded firmly. Yeah, the way Dad never, ever did. There was no response to that, so Stephanie just let a genuine, weightless smile spread across her face. That night, just as she was drifting off, she heard her bedroom door creak. Mom, you awake? I am now. What is it, honey? Chloe perched on the edge of the bed, a familiar pose that sent Stephanie hurtling back 20 years to scraped knees and stories about monsters under the bed. I have to tell you something about your son, about Eric. Instantly, Stephanie was sitting bolt upright, a cold knot of dread tightening in her gut. What about him? About 6 months ago, Chloe started. I saw him at a coffee shop. You know, we're not exactly close, but He was by himself, so I went over to say hi. She took a long, steadying breath, as if the memory itself was a heavy weight. We did the usual superficial catch up. Work's good, life's good, all that empty stuff families say. But after a minute, she went on, I realized he was acting strange. He was just moving some eggs around his plate with his fork, not eating a single bite. You could just tell something was eating him alive from the inside. What did he talk about? Stephanie urged, leaning in. He asked about you, if you were doing okay, if we still had our weekly lunch. It was just so out of character, coming from him. He's never cared about things like that. Stephanie could feel her own heart begin to race. Then he said something that's been stuck in my head ever since. He looked me dead in the eye and said, Chloe, sometimes I see Mom and I just think, we should have done more. We should have been there for her. We should have said something. Said something about what? Stephanie whispered. Exactly what I asked, Chloe confirmed with a nod. And he just shut down completely. Started playing with his water glass. Wouldn't look at me. The classic signs of someone hiding a massive secret. You could almost see the battle happening inside his head, Chloe remembered. Like this enormous, terrible truth was right on the tip of his tongue, fighting to get out, but he was terrified to let it go. She met her mother's gaze, her own eyes blazing with intensity. So I confronted him. I asked him, Eric, what do you know? What are you hiding from me? And he almost caved, Mom. I swear to you, he did. I saw him open his mouth, take this huge gulp of air, and then he just slammed it shut. He just closed his mouth, Chloe said again, the raw frustration still fresh in her voice all these months later. He got the waiter's attention, mumbled some lame excuse about a meeting he was late for. But I saw it, Mom. He was going to tell me. He was about to blow the lid off everything. Dad, the affair, all of it. So why didn't he? Stephanie asked, her voice a fragile thread. Chloe let out a long, sad sigh. Because right at that second, his phone buzzed. It was Dad. And the moment he saw that name on the screen, his entire face just collapsed. I think it was fear. Or maybe it was just pure, gut-wrenching shame, Chloe considered, her gaze unfocused. He answered, just said, I'm on my way. And he was gone. Didn't even really say goodbye. He's a coward, Mom. That's the truth of it. He's always been one. He will always pick the easy lie over the hard truth. He'll always choose Dad's approval over doing the right thing. That day, he had the chance to be a good man, and he just walked away. Do you think he feels bad about it? Stephanie asked, a tiny, fragile piece of her mother's heart still hoping. I think he'll feel bad about it tomorrow morning when he sees you walk into that courthouse, Chloe said, her voice like steel. I think he's going to have to live with this for the rest of his life. The room fell into a deep silence. Mom, I know this is an impossibly painful thing to hear. He's your son, but he made his choice. Now he has to face what comes next. I know, Stephanie finally said. I know. Chloe just gathered her mother into her arms. It's okay to fall apart now, Mom. I'm here. I've got you. This is what we do for each other. And Stephanie finally let herself go. She cried for the 33 years she had unknowingly given to a complete fabrication. She cried for the husband who had betrayed her and for the son who had let it happen. She cried for that one critical moment in a crowded cafe when her son could have been her hero and chose not to be. She cried for the woman she used to be and for the warrior she was about to become. I learned that Chloe never left her mother's side that entire, agonizing night. As the sun came up, Something in Stephanie had been reforged in the fire of her grief. She was ready, ready to walk back into the inferno, ready to take back control of her own story. And she was more than prepared to face the two men, her husband and her son, who had worked together to try and erase her from her own life. The Manhattan family court that Thursday was a portrait of quiet desperation, a muffled symphony of pain. Lawyers in $1,000 suits moved through the marble halls. Broken families sat in tense silence, and clerks hurried by with stacks of files, each one a life ripped in two. The very air in a place like that feels heavy. It's thick with the sound of clicking heels on stone, the echoes of whispered arguments that bounce off the high ceilings, and the unspoken weight of people's futures being decided behind huge, intimidating wooden doors. Stephanie was in a car down the street with Chloe and their friend Nathan. Detective Miller was already inside setting the stage. The hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. The car's clock showed 1:45. "Mom, you with us?" "How are you doing?" Chloe asked. Stephanie looked at her daughter, a woman who seemed carved from pure resolve. Chloe was wearing a sharp black pantsuit, her hair pulled back tightly, her makeup flawless but severe. She looked less like a daughter there for support and more like a five-star general on the morning of a battle she had every intention of winning. "Nervous," Stephanie admitted, her voice frail. "Very. That's normal. You're human," Chloe replied, her own voice impossibly calm. "But you have nothing to be afraid of. I'm going to be right there with you, every single step of the way." From her other side, Nathan reached over and gave her hand a solid, reassuring squeeze. "I worked with Brandon for months after the verdict, and in our sessions, he would often circle back to the moments just before his life fell apart. He described sitting in that courthouse, feeling a strange sense of calm, a powerful belief in the narrative he'd constructed. He was the grieving husband. He was the victim. He never once considered that just down the hall, his wife, Stephanie, was drawing on a reserve of strength he never knew she possessed, preparing to walk through a door he was certain he had permanently closed. He had no idea she was about to become the author of his reckoning. Brandon told me the courtroom felt small and stuffy, smelling faintly of old paper and cheap cleaner. He was already speaking when it happened, weaving his story for the judge. He felt confident, even powerful, in his performance of grief. He remembered looking over at his son, Eric, who was sitting in the gallery, a solid presence offering what Brandon interpreted as unwavering support. It was a crucial part of his delusion, the belief that he still commanded his family's loyalty, that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. He was completely insulated in his own fiction. While Stephanie was steeling herself in the hallway, bearing her fear under a layer of cold resolve, Brandon was settling into his role. He told me he felt a kind of theatrical flow, the words coming easily. The judge seemed to be listening with a sort of bored sympathy. He'd even glanced at his daughter Chloe when she first walked in, noting her dark suit. For a split second, he felt a flicker of pride. She looked so professional. He had no inkling that she was not an observer, but the architect of his destruction, a human shield for the ghost about to walk in behind her. Chloe's command to her mother to look only at her was a strategy Brandon couldn't have fathomed. He was the center of his own universe. It was inconceivable that he wouldn't be the center of theirs. He was so absorbed in his monologue of sorrow that he barely registered the soft click of the heavy oak door opening again. He told me later it wasn't a sound he even processed consciously. It was just a minor background noise in the theater of his own making, a story where he was the tragic hero, just moments away from his victory. And then he saw her. In all our sessions, this was the moment his composure would crack. His carefully crafted narrative was about a devoted husband, begging the court to help him find the woman he cherished, the wife who had simply vanished. He was mid-sentence when his eyes drifted from the judge to the doorway. The world didn't just stop, it fractured. There, standing in the doorway, was Stephanie, and next to her was his son, Eric, whose expression was not one of support, but of grim, devastating finality. The victim chair, the one he assumed would remain symbolically empty, was about to be filled. His voice, which had been a rich baritone of practiced sorrow, died in his throat. He described a sudden, shocking cold that washed through him, a physical sensation of all the blood draining from his face. It was pure, primal terror. His brain simply refused to compute what his eyes were seeing. The name that escaped his lips, Stephanie, wasn't a greeting. He described it as a gasp, the sound of a man seeing a ghost he himself had tried to create. But her eyes gave him nothing. No rage, no fear, just absence. A void where he used to be. The psychological shock was compounded when his own daughter, Chloe, approached the bench. He watched, paralyzed, as she moved with a confidence that chilled him to the bone. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was like a shard of ice. "My name is Chloe Peterson. I am an attorney, New York State Bar number 2, 87451, and I am here today representing the victim in this matter." Brandon told me he just stared, watching the judge's expression shift from mild interest to utter, slack-jawed disbelief as he looked from Chloe to the woman standing in the doorway. This wasn't supposed to happen. His plan was perfect, meticulous. In his mind, Stephanie was gone, a non-entity, legally and literally. To have her materialize in that courtroom, brought there by his own daughter, was a scenario so far outside his realm of possibility that it broke something in his mind. The judge's confused voice cut through the haze. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone turning hard, "I was under the impression you testified that your wife had disappeared." Brandon couldn't speak. He said his entire world had been reduced to the horrifying image of Stephanie, alive and present. He looked like a man staring into the face of his own damnation. His lawyer, sensing the catastrophe, jumped up, stammering about a misunderstanding. But Chloe's voice sliced right through him. "Oh, there's been no misunderstanding," she declared, her words echoing in the stunned silence. "But there has been an attempted murder, a poisoning, and a conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud. And I have brought proof of every single allegation." A wave of noise erupted in the gallery, and the sharp crack of the judge's gavel felt, to Brandon, like a gunshot. "Silence in this court! Miss Peterson, you must realize those are monumentally serious accusations." Brandon clung to that, a tiny spark of hope, but Chloe's response extinguished it completely. "I am fully aware, Your Honor, which is why I've come prepared." He watched in a detached horror as she opened her briefcase. The binders she pulled out didn't look like legal documents. They looked like tombstones. He knew, with a sickening certainty, what was in them. His texts with Megan, the encrypted messages with his son, Eric, the whole sordid, damning trail he thought he'd erased. It was an avalanche he had started, and it was about to bury him. Each document Chloe presented was a hammer blow. "This document," she announced, and Brandon felt the air leave his lungs. Is the pharmacy receipt for the benzodiazepine derivative the defendant used to poison my mother? This is the forged prescription he used to obtain it? And this, the pause was torturous, is the toxicology report confirming that exact substance was in her system. But this is the moment he put it there. She held up a tiny silver flash drive, and in that moment, he knew there was no escape. When the monitors flickered on, Brandon described feeling a profound sense of disassociation, like he was watching a movie about some other monster. But it was him. Grainy, but unmistakably him, looking over his shoulder before tipping that white powder into a coffee cup. And then, the smile. Seeing himself offer the poisoned cup to Stephanie with a casual, loving smile, that was the moment he truly saw the stranger he had become. It was a grotesque parody of the husband he had once been. Chloe's voice was the detached narration to his downfall. And here, you can see him assisting the victim who was visibly disoriented onto a bus. He remembered that moment, her leaning on him, his feigned concern. And this is the defendant, walking away from that same bus terminal without a single backward glance, leaving the victim behind him, drugged and helpless, with a one-way ticket to Omaha, Nebraska under the alias Emily Ross. The clinical precision of her words stripped away all his self-deception, leaving only the ugly truth. The judge's face was a mask of cold fury. When he turned that gaze on him, Brandon felt physically pinned to his chair. Mr. Peterson, is there anything at all you wish to say in your defense? The confident man who had walked into the courtroom that morning was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell. His voice, when he found it, was a pathetic, cracking whisper. Your Honor, it's a lie. My wife is confused. It was the last desperate grasp of a drowning man. She's been through something terrible. She doesn't know what she's saying. But then Stephanie spoke, and her voice, clear and steady, cut him to the core. Every person in that room turned to her, but she looked only at him. And in that moment, he wasn't facing a judge or a jury. He was facing his victim, who had reclaimed her own story. I know exactly what I am saying, she said, her eyes locking with his. I know you told me the coffee was a special blend. I know you leaned in, and I know you whispered that in 1 hour I wouldn't even be able to remember my own name. I've worked with many people in crisis, but the story of Brandon Peterson is one that has stayed with me. He told me it all started with his wife Stephanie's voice, a sound he had known for decades, suddenly transformed into something as cold and sharp as forged steel. I know, she'd said, her words cutting through his denial, that you used our credit card to buy a bus ticket to Omaha for a woman named Emily Ross. A one-way ticket, Brandon. A ticket meant to send me away with no memory, no ID, and not a single soul to call for help. In our sessions, he would recount how, in that moment, he felt the floor drop out from under him. I know about your affair with Jessica, she continued, each word a hammer blow. I know about the nearly $1 million you owe to a loan shark. And I know you planned this entire nightmare for one reason, to get my money. He remembered her standing there, radiating a strength he hadn't seen in years. The money from the company I started on my kitchen table, she'd said, her voice ringing with the truth of it. The stores I built, the assets I grew while you were off playing CEO of a company that never earned a single dime. Brandon described to me how his blood ran cold, a clammy sweat breaking out on his forehead. He was trembling, a visible tremor he couldn't control. He tried the old words, the familiar script. "Stephanie, my love, just let me explain." But she cut him off with a viciousness that shocked him. "Don't you ever call me your love again," she spat. "You gave up that right the second you decided my life was worth less than your gambling debts." The scene in the courtroom, as he described it, was a masterfully orchestrated ambush. His daughter, Chloe, moved to stand beside Stephanie, a simple gesture of solidarity that felt like a betrayal. "Your Honor," Chloe began, her voice steady. "In addition to the evidence we've presented, we have corroborating testimony. The pharmacist you coerced into filling the prescription has already given a full, recorded confession to Detective Miller." Brandon felt his breath catch, but the worst was yet to come. Chloe paused, letting her gaze sweep over the gallery before landing with surgical precision. "We also have the testimony of the defendant's own son, Eric Peterson, who knew about his father's affair for over a year and who was instructed to commit perjury in this courtroom today. That," he told me, "was the moment his world stopped spinning." Sitting there in the witness chair, he felt himself physically shrink, the life draining out of him until his skin felt like thin, dry paper. He remembered trying to speak, a shattered, I, I didn't, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence of the room. He saw his other daughter, Olivia, fix him with a stare so cold it could have frozen flames. "We found the messages, Eric," she said, her voice utterly devoid of emotion, a pronouncement of guilt. "We have the audio recording of you asking him, 'Dad, does Mom suspect anything? Does that ring a bell?'" Brandon watched his son's face, saw the gears in his mind grind to a catastrophic halt. The boy was trapped. His mouth opened, a silent gasp, but no sound came out. Olivia, having delivered the killing blow, turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we move for the defendant, Brandon Peterson, to be taken into custody immediately. We are also formally requesting an investigation into Eric Peterson for conspiracy." Brandon watched the judge, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, give a single decisive nod. "Motion granted, bailiff." But the word was cut short by a deafening crash as the courtroom doors were thrown open. And then she was there. Jessica, a perfect caricature of the other woman, all platinum hair and a dress that looked painted on, sprinting into the room and screaming his name. "Brandon! Brandon, what is happening?" She was like a heat-seeking missile aimed right for his table, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just run headlong into the blast zone of a detonation he had created, running straight toward the woman whose existence he had tried to erase. He watched, helpless, as Jessica's frantic eyes finally landed on Stephanie. He described it to me as watching a person's entire reality shatter in slow motion. First, a flicker of confusion, then the sickening click of recognition, and finally, a tidal wave of pure animal fear. "You, you're alive," Jessica whispered, the words barely audible. He saw Stephanie allow a small, chilling smile to touch her lips. Surprise, Jessica recoiled as if she'd been physically struck. "I didn't know," she pleaded, her voice breaking, turning toward him. "He told me you were just separating. He swore to me everything was fine." It was Olivia who answered, her tone dripping with contempt. "He promised a lot of things, didn't he?" "He promised he would leave my mother," Olivia continued, her voice relentless. "Promised he'd fix his finances, promised you two a brand new life, and you believed every single one of his lies." Jessica's head snapped back toward Brandon, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic appeal. "Brandon, do something. Tell them it isn't true." But he couldn't speak. He told me he just stared at the floor, at the scuffed tiles as if the answers were written there. He was hollow, a shell. Then, something inside him snapped. A raw, guttural roar ripped from his throat. "Shut up! Jessica!" It was the first coherent sound he'd made, a violent crack in the composed facade he had desperately tried to maintain. Jessica flinched, her whole body recoiling from the force of his voice, but his outburst had broken her too. "You promised me," she shrieked, her own sanity unraveling in a spectacular display. "You promised we would finally be together. You said she would just disappear and we could start our life." He bellowed again, a sound of pure panic. "I told you to shut up." But the floodgates were open. "You told me the medicine would make her forget everything, that she'd be a Jane Doe in some hospital and no one would ever know. You said all her money would finally be ours." A profound, bone-deep silence descended upon the courtroom. With that one panicked confession, Jessica had just signed both of their fates. He saw it happen as if in a dream. Detective Miller, who had been standing quietly at the back, began a slow, deliberate walk toward her. Brandon knew what was coming. "Jessica Hayes," the detective said, his voice calm but unbreakable. "You are being detained as an accessory to attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." "Anything you say," Detective Miller continued, reciting the Miranda rights as if reading a grocery list, "can and will be used against you in a court of law." That's when Jessica's screaming began, a primal, horrifying sound of an animal caught in a trap. "I didn't do anything wrong. It was all him. I just loved him." Two bailiffs took her by the arms and started to lead her away. He watched her devolve into a storm of hysteria, her mascara carving black rivers through her makeup as the entire illusion of her life crumbled away. He watched them drag her out, and then his gaze was drawn back to Stephanie. She took one single deliberate step toward him. "So that was her," she said, her voice a quiet poison that filled the silent room. "That's the woman you were willing to destroy my life for. The woman you thought was worth more than our 33 years together." Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, taking in the pathetic ruin of the man he'd become. "She's not even that pretty." From the gallery, someone let out a choked, disbelieving laugh. Brandon told me he felt what little blood was left in him turn to fire, a deep, mottled red of absolute humiliation flooding his face. And in that instant, his body just gave out. In front of the judge, the lawyers, his own children, Brandon Peterson's legs simply buckled. He didn't so much fall as he crumpled, landing in a heap on the courtroom floor like a marionette whose strings had been violently severed. "Stephanie," he rasped, his voice a shredded, pathetic whisper. "Stephanie, please forgive me. I know I destroyed everything, but I love you. I swear to God, I still love you." He was performing a role he no longer had the right to play. "I have always loved you," he sobbed, the tears now flowing freely. He looked up at her, this woman he had known for more than 3 decades, the woman he had tried to poison and erase, and he saw nothing but a statue of resolve. There he was, on his knees on a dirty floor, begging for the very person he tried to annihilate to be his salvation. "Please, Stephanie, just tell them you forgive me. Tell the judge this was all just some horrible misunderstanding. We can fix this, baby," he pleaded, reaching a shaking hand out to her. "I know we can. We can go back to how it was." Her voice, when it came, was like a shard of ice. "Get up. He just kept sobbing, lost in his own desperate performance. "Stephanie, please. Get up," she repeated, and this time the words were sharpened to a razor's edge. He flinched. "You want my pity?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that chilled him to the bone. "You? The man who drafted the blueprint for my destruction? Who was going to steal everything I built while I wandered this country nameless? You have the audacity to ask for pity from me?" "I gave you 33 years," she said, and each word felt like a physical blow. 33 years of my life, my trust, my love, and it was all built on your lies. And this was how you repaid me. She took a step back, creating a small but final chasm between them. "Get off the floor, Brandon. Get up and face what you've done like a man." He struggled to his feet, a weak, trembling wreck. The charming, confident man who had entered the courtroom that morning was gone, replaced by this pathetic shell. "Now," she said, her voice ringing with the finality of a slamming iron door. "You will go to prison, and I will move on with my life, and the only peace I will need is knowing I never have to see your face again." With that, she turned her back on him. "Stephanie! Stephanie!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate, childish panic. But she never broke her stride. He watched her walk away as Detective Miller stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs. He heard the detective's calm, procedural voice. "Brandon Peterson, you are under arrest for attempted murder," followed by the cold, metallic click as the cuffs closed around his wrists. His own desperate shouts of her name followed her out of the room, a haunting echo of his failure. But she never looked back. As they passed him, Detective Miller met his eyes for a second. "You'll rot in there, Brandon. I'll see to it." Brandon just numbly nodded. "I know you will," he whispered. The second, the heavy courtroom door closed, sealing his fate. His mind pivoted from the wife he had lost to the son who had betrayed him. He saw Eric, a statue of pure shock, still sitting in the witness chair, where his life had also imploded. The boy hadn't moved an inch during the chaos of his father's arrest or Jessica's meltdown. Olivia was standing there, a guardian at the gate of their new, fractured family. "Eric," she said, her voice as brittle as shattering glass. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" He finally looked up, and Brandon met the tear-filled eyes of his son. The eyes of a boy he had taught to lie, a boy he had been willing to sacrifice. "Mom," Eric stammered, looking past Brandon toward the empty doorway. I I swear I didn't know he was going to do that. I promise." It was the weak, hollow promise of a boy who had learned deception from his own father. As a counselor, you see the intricate ways families fracture. But Brandon's case was something else entirely. He built his world on a foundation of control. And his son, Eric, was the cornerstone of that illusion. Brandon didn't just encourage Eric's silence about the affair with Chloe. He engineered it through years of subtle manipulation. He'd groomed his son to see family loyalty as synonymous with loyalty to him. So when his wife, Stephanie, confronted Eric about his complicity, it wasn't just a family argument. It was the first tremor that threatened Brandon's entire kingdom. Eric's stammered excuses about not wanting to get in the middle were the programmed responses of a boy terrified of his father's disapproval. Brandon had meticulously planned to use his own son as a shield in court. He'd coached Eric, feeding him a narrative of a perfect marriage to perjure himself with, turning the boy into an instrument for stealing everything his mother, Stephanie, had ever built. In Brandon's mind, this was a logical, even necessary step. It wasn't about truth, it was about winning. When his daughter, Jessica, confronted Eric, her words, "You chose his money over our mother," were the precise emotional shiv that finally severed the puppet strings. Eric's breakdown wasn't just about guilt, it was the shattering of a lifetime of conditioning, the sudden, horrifying realization of the role his father had cast for him. The true consequences for Brandon began to solidify in the courtroom's sterile silence. For years, he had operated from behind a mask of charm and authority, but now that mask was gone. His son, Eric's apology to Stephanie was a public rejection of everything Brandon stood for. When Stephanie told Eric, "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Brandon, from his defendant's chair, likely felt nothing for his son's pain. Instead, he would have registered it as a strategic loss, a key witness turning against him. Eric's flight from the room wasn't just a son's sorrow. It was the retreat of Brandon's most vital piece of armor. The moment the door closed on his crumbling son, Brandon would have seen two things that confirmed his world was ending. He saw his daughter, Jessica, a force of nature he could never control, embracing her mother. And then he saw Mark, a man who represented everything Brandon wasn't: quiet, steady, and genuinely devoted to Stephanie. Mark's presence in that courtroom wasn't just support for Stephanie, it was a living symbol of Brandon's replacement. When Stephanie turned to face Mark, the connection between them was a verdict in itself, delivered long before the judge ever spoke. For a narcissist like Brandon, being replaced is a fate worse than death. He watched Stephanie and Mark, a man who had apparently held a torch for her for 4 decades and heard her breathe, "It's finally done." But it was Mark's gentle correction, "It's just beginning," that would have chilled Brandon to the bone. It signaled a future he had no part in. The 18 months that followed were a systematic dismantling of his life, starting with the judge handing him an 18-year prison sentence. Attempted murder, felony poisoning, grand larceny. Each charge was a nail in the coffin of the powerful man he believed himself to be. It was a complete and total erasure. The judge's words were a public autopsy of his character, highlighting the premeditation and the sheer, chilling cruelty of his actions against Stephanie. This wasn't just a sentence. It was a moral condemnation designed to strip him of any lingering dignity. His mistress, Chloe, was handed 4 years for her part as an accessory. From what I gathered, Brandon felt only contempt for her defense. Her attempt to portray herself as another one of his victims was, in his eyes, a pathetic and weak performance, a betrayal of the grand, illicit world he thought they had built together. The digital trail they left behind, every text message a breadcrumb leading to their conspiracy, sealed Chloe's fate, and Brandon likely watched her downfall with a detached sense of scorn. The implosion of her life, losing her personal training clients, her job at the fitness club, her social media revenue, was just collateral damage in his war. The story of her being seen working at a supermarket checkout, a ghost of her former self, wouldn't have elicited an ounce of sympathy from him. In his mind, she was simply a failed accomplice who wasn't smart enough to get away with it. So, when the news eventually reached him that Stephanie's reaction to seeing Chloe's diminished state was a profound emptiness, it would have been baffling to him. He operated on a spectrum of triumph and vengeance. The concept of moving on, of feeling nothing, was alien. As for his son, Eric, escaping a prison sentence was irrelevant. Brandon saw the public verdict, the media headlines, the viral story of his complicity, as the real punishment. Eric's entire world was set ablaze, and from a prison cell, Brandon would have seen it as a fitting consequence for his son's ultimate disloyalty. The headlines branding Eric as the son who knew about the poisoning plot and did nothing were a source of grim satisfaction for Brandon. He had lost, but he had dragged his son down with him. Eric's firing, the loss of his friends, his fiancée leaving, it was all confirmation of Brandon's worldview. You are either with me or you are destroyed. He wouldn't have processed Stephanie's reaction, that deep, cavernous void, as grief, but as weakness. Her immediate return to her boutiques was something he could understand, but only through his own lens of power and control. For Brandon, hearing about Stephanie's success, learning that profits had actually climbed in her absence, would have been a fresh wound. It proved she never needed him, the most painful truth a man like him can face. The quiet, patient reconstruction of her life with Mark, the daily phone calls, the weekends together, was a slow-motion torture. Every detail of their unfolding happiness was a testament to his own monumental failure. Their decision to let things evolve naturally stood in stark contrast to his own life of frantic, calculated manipulation. Mark's sentiment, "I've been waiting 40 years. I can wait a bit more," spoke to a depth of devotion Brandon could never comprehend, let alone replicate. And Jessica, his daughter, remained a constant, defiant pillar at her mother's side. Their renewed, honest relationship was built on the ashes of his secrets. When Jessica asked her mother, "Mom, are you happy?" it was a question Brandon had likely never genuinely asked. He only cared about the appearance of happiness, a prop for his perfect life. Stephanie's honest reply, "I'm working on it," was a sign of a resilience he had tried and failed to extinguish. Her acknowledgement that Mark was helping her heal was another confirmation that he was utterly forgotten. So, when, nearly 2 years into his sentence, he learned that his son had sought out Stephanie, it would have sparked a flicker of something venomous. Eric was, in his eyes, a loose end, a traitor still capable of causing damage. He would have seen the meeting not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an act of profound weakness. The description of his son's appearance, gaunt, weary, dressed in worn-out clothes, would have filled Brandon with disgust. He had raised Eric to be a polished successor, a reflection of his own ambition. To see him reduced to this was, for Brandon, a personal insult. Stephanie's hesitation, her heart pounding like a trapped bird, was a fear he himself had instilled. For him, her decision to finally face Eric was a critical moment, another chance for his son to fail him by groveling. As Eric stood on that pavement, a broken man asking to come inside, Brandon would have been rooting for Stephanie to turn him away, to inflict the ultimate punishment. The charged silence between them was the sound of his own legacy being weighed and judged. Eric's simple request, "I need to talk to you," was a surrender, and in Brandon's world, surrender was the most unforgivable sin. The internal war within Stephanie was something he could no longer influence, a terrifying loss of control. When Stephanie granted Eric 5 minutes, it was a display of power that once belonged only to Brandon. Her using the office desk as a shield was a gesture he would have understood perfectly, a barrier against a threat. As his son stood before her, utterly lost, Brandon would have felt nothing but contempt. Eric's opening words, "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness," would have been a surprising and perhaps even slightly intriguing gambit. It was a deviation from the script of pathetic begging he had expected. Eric's admission, "I know I have no right to it," followed by Stephanie's cold, level question, Then, "What are you doing here?" was a dialogue of ghosts. This was the conversation he, Brandon, should have been having, but he was incapable of such introspection. Hearing his son articulate the depth of his failure, the way he had been twisted and manipulated, would have been like listening to an indictment from a stranger. It was a clear-eyed analysis of the very poison Brandon had injected into his family for decades. Eric's final, devastating realization. Mom, I realized I had become him, just a carbon copy of Dad. This was the truth Brandon had spent his entire life running from. To hear his own son, his own creation, speak those words would be the ultimate judgment. It confirmed that his legacy wasn't wealth or success, but a sickness he had passed down. In that moment, through his son's confession, Brandon was forced to see the monster he had truly allowed himself to become. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Brandon said again, his voice cracking with a desperate sincerity that was new and unsettling. "I just, I had to tell you that I'm trying. I need to be a different person than I was. I want to earn the right, if you ever let me, to be your son again." The silence that hung in the air between them was immense, a physical weight. "And what exactly is your strategy for that?" Stephanie finally asked, her tone devoid of warmth. "I don't have one," he admitted, his shoulders slumping. "But I was thinking, maybe you could use some help here. At the shop, I'll do absolutely anything." He listed off tasks with a kind of frantic energy, moving heavy boxes, overhauling the chaotic stockroom, even just sweeping the floors. He made it painfully clear he expected no pay, no kindness, not even a conversation. All he was begging for was a single chance to exist in her space, to prove through sheer physical effort that his commitment to change was more than just words. Stephanie looked at her son, this young man whose complicity had nearly cost her everything, who had chosen to stand with a monster instead of his own mother. And for the first time since it all fell apart, she saw something new flicker in his eyes, a deep, agonizing shame that had finally found its way to the surface. "The stockroom is a complete disaster," she stated, after a silence that felt like an eternity. "There are boxes back there from years ago. They all need to be inventoried and reorganized by size on the shelves." "I can do that," Brandon responded instantly, a surge of relief in his voice. "For the first 30 days, you're not an employee. You show up, you do the work in silence, and you leave. No talking, no excuses. If you're still here in a month, we can talk then. Do you understand?" "And Brandon," she added just as he was turning to leave. "Yes?" "If you miss one single day, this arrangement is over. Permanently." "I won't, Mom. I swear I won't." He started the very next morning. For weeks, they were like two planets in a silent, painful orbit, never speaking, barely making eye contact. He would clock in at 8 a.m. sharp, disappear into the stockroom, and throw himself into the grueling manual labor that everyone else on staff actively avoided. At the end of his shift, he'd leave without a word. Then, about 3 weeks into this strange penance, Stephanie was walking past the stockroom and heard his voice, patiently showing a new part-timer how to use the inventory system. "It just makes everything way easier to find," he was explaining. "My mom designed this system a while back. It's actually brilliant." My mom. He hadn't used her first name. He had called her my mom. The word landed in her heart with a surprising and complicated weight. It had been just 1 month, 4 weeks that felt like a lifetime since their world had shattered, when Stephanie took an unbelievable risk. She brought her son Brandon back into the business, placing him on the sales floor under the careful supervision of her partner, Eric. And the astonishing thing was, he was good at it. He had this quiet, disarming way of truly listening to customers, of understanding the unspoken needs behind their questions. But after 3 months of this fragile new arrangement, Eric took him aside. "Brandon," he began, his voice low and serious, "you seem different." Brandon's eyes, still clouded by a guilt that never quite faded, met his. "I have to be, Eric," he whispered, the words heavy with a past he couldn't escape. "I just have to." But Eric could still sense a shadow that clung to him, a profound sadness that seemed etched into his very being. In that quiet office, something inside Brandon finally broke. He looked at Stephanie, this woman who had pulled herself back from the brink of total destruction, and his voice fractured. "You are the toughest person I've ever known. You rebuilt your whole life from nothing. And I just stood there, ready to help him tear it all down." He vowed, his body trembling with the force of his conviction, that he would spend every single day he had left trying to rebuild the trust he'd so carelessly destroyed. The silence returned, thick and absolute. Finally, Stephanie's voice cut through it, calm and measured. "Dinner? Tomorrow night? Jessica will be there." Terror and a wild, desperate hope warred across Brandon's face. "Mom, are you sure?" Her answer was brutally honest. "No, but I have to try. You know your sister hates me for even considering this, and I can't say she's wrong." "I know," Brandon conceded, his voice almost a whisper. "But she is your sister," Stephanie said, the words landing like a verdict. "And a family, a real one, is supposed to try, especially when it feels this impossible." That was it. That was the tiny sliver of grace that finally shattered his composure. He didn't make a sound, but silent tears began to trace paths down his cheeks. "Thank you, Mom. Oh my God, thank you." She held up a hand, her expression firm. "Don't thank me yet. This doesn't fix anything. It just means I'm willing to start the work. There's a universe of difference." He could only manage a nod. "I understand." "Good," she said, her tone all business again. "Now, get back to work. Those inventory files won't sort themselves," she added, a hint of her old, sharp self in her voice. He let out a choked, watery laugh through his tears. "Yes, ma'am." Stephanie watched him walk out of her office, feeling a hurricane of conflicting emotions. That was her son, the boy who had betrayed her in the most profound way imaginable, and the man who was now fighting with everything he had to become someone she could trust again. Forgiveness felt like a distant country she wasn't sure she'd ever have the visa to enter. But for the very first time, she could faintly make out a single, winding path that might, one day, lead her there. They were both trying, and sometimes, as she had learned in the most brutal way possible, trying is the only thing that matters. The dinner was scheduled for a Friday. All day long, Stephanie was a mess of frayed nerves. She painstakingly made Jessica's favorite dish, a ridiculously complicated eggplant lasagna, and opened a bottle of vintage wine she'd been saving. She set the table with the focus of a surgeon, arranging flowers and lighting candles until the room had a soft, warm glow. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a tense summit between warring nations, the opening ceremony of a fragile new era. Jessica was the first to arrive, looking beautiful as always, but her face was hard, a rigid set to her jaw that signaled she wasn't there to make peace. She knew her brother was coming, and forgiveness was not on her agenda. "Are you 100% sure about this, Mom?" she asked, her voice quiet and strained. "No," Stephanie admitted, meeting her daughter's steely gaze. "But I have to be. I need to find out for myself if he's really capable of changing. And I think, somewhere deep down, you need to see it too." Jessica didn't respond, choosing instead to sink onto the couch and cross her arms, her expression an unreadable mask. Eric arrived a few minutes later, having driven down from his place upstate to be her emotional support for the night. The second he stepped inside, Jessica stood up and gave him a real hug, her protective armor softening for just a moment. "Hi, Eric. Thanks for being here." He gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Wouldn't have missed it. And then it happened. The sharp, jarring ring of the doorbell cut through the tense quiet like a knife. It was Brandon. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, Stephanie went to open the door. This, right here, is where the real work of healing begins. It's a story about the fallout, about navigating the emotional wreckage long after the explosion. Picture Brandon standing in the doorway of the house he was raised in, a place that now felt like a foreign country. He's clutching a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers, looking like a nervous kid on a first date. His mother opens the door. "Come in," she says, her voice flat and empty. He steps over the threshold, and every familiar painting and family photo on the wall seems to mock him with memories. And then he sees his sister. Across the living room, Jessica's eyes lock onto his. A crushing silence descends, filled with years of unspoken rage and betrayal. This was the confrontation that had been brewing for months, and the dining room table was set to be the battlefield. In one corner was Jessica, her posture ramrod straight, a loyal defender of her mother's honor. In the other was her brother, Brandon, the prodigal son who had chosen their father's side when their world imploded. When Brandon finally found his voice to say her name, it came out as a strangled whisper that the suffocating quiet swallowed whole. Her response was a single, cutting look that was colder than any word. He tried to speak, to call himself a coward, but she silenced him without saying a thing, making it clear his self-pity had no value here. Not tonight. And maybe never. Brandon's apology died on his lips. Jessica then laid out the rules for the evening with cold, brutal efficiency. She was there for one person, their mother, Stephanie. This was not a discussion or a chance for him to plead his case. It was a temporary ceasefire, a special permit allowing him to breathe the same air for a few hours for their mom's sake. That was the extent of the offer. Once he absorbed that, she nodded curtly toward the lasagna, a silent order to start what was guaranteed to be the most agonizing meal of their lives. Eric, to his credit, tried with all his might to paddle the conversation into the safe, shallow waters of normal life. It was a heroic effort. He brought up a new project at his firm, a story in the news. Any topic at all to fill the vast, echoing silence that betrayal had carved into their family. Brandon, for his part, was practically invisible. He pushed the food around his plate, offering only one-word answers when spoken to directly. He understood his place. He was a visitor on supervised release in the very home he had helped to shatter. All the while, Jessica maintained a perfect, impenetrable wall, chatting warmly with Eric and laughing with Stephanie, but never, not even for a second, letting her gaze fall on her brother. I worked with a man once, let's call him Eric, whose actions detonated a bomb in the center of his family. Years later, I think about the fallout, especially one evening that he wasn't even present for. The story of that dinner is the story of the shrapnel. It began when his ex-wife, Sarah, brought out a flan. This wasn't just dessert, it was an artifact from a life Eric had systematically tried to erase, a family recipe passed down through generations. Placing it on the table was an act of defiance. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, and the fragile piece shattered. Every person in that room turned to face a woman who had been silenced for years and was, at last, ready to reclaim her own story. What Sarah shared next was the anatomy of the horror Eric had inflicted upon her. A little over 2 years ago, she told them, she had woken up on a bus with no memory, her mind a fog of chemicals. The architect of that fog was the man she had spent over 3 decades with. I remember Eric describing his plan with a chilling detachment. It was a psychological demolition. He wanted to wipe her clean, erase her identity, and discard the shell. But a flicker of her survived. She woke up. Her voice shook with the memory. Yet, it held the room in a vice as she detailed the true cost of her survival, the agonizing realization that her entire 33-year marriage had been a meticulously crafted lie. But the devastation, she explained, had spread further. The man she thought she knew as her son, Spencer, had been replaced by a stranger who chose to stand by his father, the abuser. Her fundamental trust in the world, that bedrock belief that your family will protect you, had been burned to the ground. As tears finally traced paths down her face, her voice found a new strength. She began to speak not of what was lost, but of what she had found in the wreckage. She found the unshakable truth of her daughter, Ashley, whose loyalty and courage had been her lifeline. She looked right at Ashley, and in that shared glance, a torrent of pain and love flowed between them as they wept together. Her gaze then shifted to Nathan. She spoke of being given a second chance at a love that had waited patiently for 40 years. His own eyes shone with unshed tears as he gave her a small, overwhelmed smile. Finally, she looked at Spencer. The last thing she had gained, she said, was a tiny, terrifyingly fragile hope. It was the hope that, even after such catastrophic betrayal, redemption might be possible, that the worst chapter doesn't have to be the last one, that a family, shattered into a million pieces, could at least begin the search for the glue. Spencer couldn't look at her. He just stared at his own hands, a portrait of shame, as his own silent tears began to fall. That, she said, was her toast. To family. Not the one you're given, she clarified, but the one you build, the one that shields you when the world is on fire, the family that keeps trying, even when every part of you says it's hopeless. She raised her glass. Instantly, Ashley's was beside hers. Her toast was simple, aimed directly at her mother, Sarah, the strongest woman she had ever known, the person who taught her to plant her feet and fight. "I am so unbelievably proud to be your daughter every single day," Ashley said, her voice thick with a fierce, protective love that had been forged in crisis. "You have always been, and will always be, my hero." Then Nathan lifted his glass. He spoke to the whole table, but his eyes were only for Sarah, the woman he confessed he'd loved his entire life but had been too scared to tell. He said she was the one who had saved him from himself 4 decades ago, and he intended to spend whatever time he had left proving his love for her. Reaching across the table, Nathan's hand covered hers, his voice thick with an emotion that had been waiting 40 years to be spoken. He told Sarah every single second of that wait was worth it to be here now. In that moment, the entire emotional gravity of the room shifted, landing squarely on Spencer. The silence was deafening. He stared into his glass of red wine as if it held the answers he so desperately needed. With a heavy scrape of wood on the wood, he pushed his chair back and stood. He couldn't make a toast, he said, his voice strained. He didn't have the right. He confessed he wasn't worthy of a mother like Sarah or a sister with the loyalty of Ashley, not after his choices. His composure finally crumbled, and the silent tears gave way to deep, ragged sobs. And then he said it, the two words he owed his mother from 2 years ago, his eyes finally locking with hers. He was sorry. Sorry for every time he chose his father's version of reality, for every moment he ignored the gut-wrenching truth because the lie Eric had built was just an easier place to live. "I'm sorry I was a coward," he choked out, his voice cracking before turning his gaze to his sister. "Ashley, you were always the brave one, always." It was a complete surrender. He admitted she had seen their father for the monster he was while he was busy defending him. She had chosen their mother's truth while he had chosen his father's money. She was the daughter Sarah deserved, he said, and he was just the son she was stuck with. In that moment of raw honesty, you could see a microscopic shift in Ashley's guarded expression. It was nowhere near forgiveness. It wasn't even in the same state. But it might have been the first sign of a thaw after a long, bitter winter. Spencer pushed on, clarifying that he wasn't asking for their pardon because he knew he was light years away from earning it. Instead, he made a promise, a vow to them both. He swore he would spend the rest of his days trying to become the son and brother they should have had all along. His hand trembled as he finally raised his wine glass. "To my mother," he said, "the strongest person I've ever known." The very woman whose reality he had helped deny, who was now, against all odds, offering this sliver of a chance. He promised he wouldn't waste it, but his words just hung there, absorbed by a heavy, profound silence. Ashley's face was a mask of stone. Her glass never left the table. She wouldn't even look at him. Spencer stood there alone, his toast turning to smoke in the air. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, his arm dropped to his side, and he collapsed back into his chair, the picture of defeat. That night, only 3 glasses were raised in toast: Sarah's, Ashley's, and Nathan's. Spencer just stared at his plate. The dinner ended soon after, wrapped in a thick blanket of tension. The flan sat untouched. Ashley left first, pulling her mother into a fierce, protective hug at the door. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. "I love you too, my girl." Then she brought up Spencer, her voice low and firm. She told her mother she hadn't forgiven him, and she wasn't sure if forgiveness was even possible for her. He could work at the family business. He could try to be better. But the brother she had loved died for her the day he stood with their father in court. "I get that you want us to be a family again," she told Sarah, "but some things, once they're shattered, they just don't go back together." "Some pieces just don't fit anymore," she finished. After a soft kiss on her mother's forehead, her last words were, "You have too much grace, Mom. I don't." And she was gone. Spencer left a few minutes later. He paused in the doorway, thanking Sarah for the dinner, for the chance. She just looked at her son, this boy who had helped tear down her world and was now asking for blueprints to rebuild it, and gave him the only thing she had left, the unvarnished truth. He stood there and took it. She told him she didn't know if forgiveness, true forgiveness, was in the cards. He could work at the store, he could continue to show up, but he had to understand that the life they had before was gone. It was a ghost. It could never be brought back. Fresh tears rolled down his cheeks. I understand, Mom, he whispered. I hope so, she replied, because Ashley won't bend. And as for me, I'm trying. But trying isn't a promise, she added. I know. She told him to go. She'd see him on Monday. His eyes flickered past her to the living room where Nathan was waiting. Look after her, Spencer said to him, a quiet plea. She deserves someone who will. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. There was no embrace, no pardon, not even a hint that absolution was on the horizon. Sarah closed the door. At last, they were alone. Are you okay? Nathan asked, his voice gentle. And she was. For the first time in years, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. He came closer, taking both of her hands into his. Sarah, he started, there is something I need to ask. She felt her own heart speed up, and she held her breath. He acknowledged the hell she'd been through and her need for time, but he confessed that the thought of another day without her in it was unbearable. So, what's the end game here, Nathan? She asked, her voice so soft he had to lean in. He laid it all out with a terrifying and beautiful simplicity. The end game is that I love you, Sarah. I think I've loved you my whole life, and I'm done wasting it. I want to spend whatever time I have left right here, with you. He quickly added that he wasn't proposing. His own divorce after 33 years was still fresh. But he needed her to know, without a doubt, that he was not letting her go a second time. She just looked at him, really seeing the man who had waited, the one who had found her in the ruins and wasn't afraid of the scars. Nathan, she whispered. He leaned in a little closer. Yeah? A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that night. Be quiet and kiss me. A sound that was half a laugh and half a sob escaped his lips, and he did. It was a kiss that held 40 years of waiting, a kiss that tasted like a second chance at life. When they finally pulled away from their embrace, it was Nathan who was crying. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were tears of absolute, unfiltered joy. I married the wrong man all those years ago, she told him, her own voice thick with emotion. This time, I'm finally making the right choice. He needed to hear it, to be sure. She just smiled through her own tears and said, I'm 40 years certain. They just stood there, holding one another in the quiet house, two forgotten glasses of wine on the table, right at the very beginning of everything. I remember when Brandon first sat in my office, he made it clear this wasn't a story with a neatly tied bow at the end. The future was a vast, foggy landscape, and he had no map. He spoke about the immense difficulty of processing forgiveness for his ex-wife Stephanie, whose actions felt less like a simple betrayal and more like a calculated dismantling of his life. Then, there was the chasm between his children. The question of whether his daughter, Emily, could ever look at her brother, Eric, without seeing the shadow of his complicity. The emotional shrapnel was everywhere, a kind of biblical demolition that leaves foundations cracked forever. But through the fog, a single, hard truth kept him standing. He had weathered the slow drip poison of his wife's deception and the hollow complicity of his own son. What his psyche had to grapple with was the sheer scale of it all. 33 years, an entire adult life lived inside an elaborate fiction, a cold and patient conspiracy aimed at his eventual erasure. And yet, the man in front of me was not erased. I saw him find solace in the arms of a woman who offered genuine, unconditional love. I saw him draw strength from his daughter, who became his anchor in the storm, his one true north. And he had his business, a tangible thing he had built with his own hands and heart. This wasn't some fairy tale victory. There was far too much loss for that. But it was a foothold, a chance to build something real. And in the aftermath of total collapse, a new beginning is the most profound gift there is. The irony was staggering. Stephanie had orchestrated a plan for his slow, quiet fade into nothingness, a social and emotional death sentence. Instead, he was the one who, with quiet dignity, provided detectives with the final pieces they needed to secure her conviction. He had built his world on the belief that he knew his wife and son, the two people who were supposed to be his sanctuary. But crisis has a brutal way of stripping away masks, of forcing people to reveal the core of who they are when the pressure is on. And the ruins of their family stand as a heartbreaking testament to that chilling, undeniable truth.